Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through one of England's most turbulent yet fascinating periods, a time when the very fabric of the kingdom tore apart, when cousins battled for a crown, and when the concept of royal succession hung by the thinnest of threads. Tonight's story is about Stephen, later known as King Stephen of England, a man whose reign would become synonymous with chaos, civil war, and the period historians would come to call the Anarchy, from the frozen year of 1135 to the peaceful autumn of 1154. We will walk together through 19 years that reshaped England's future and gave birth to one of its greatest dynasties. This is not just a tale of battles and sieges, though we'll witness those in abundance. This is a story of human ambition, of family betrayal, of a woman who fought to claim what was rightfully hers, and of a charming but fatally indecisive king who could neither fully win nor completely lose. It's a story of frozen rivers crossed in the dead of night, of castles that sprouted across the landscape like mushrooms after rain, and of barons who grew so powerful that even kings trembled before them. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you. Don't be shy. Drop a gentle comment below about which part of medieval history fascinates you most, or perhaps share which historical figure you'd like us to explore next. Your thoughts help us create the content that soothes you to sleep, and if you're finding comfort in these whispered tales from the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our Sleepy Crown family. Each like and subscription helps us continue bringing these peaceful historical journeys to you, night after restful night. So settle yourself deeper into your pillows, pull your blankets close, and let the soft glow of your screen be the last light you see tonight. Close your eyes if you wish. My voice will guide you through this tale. Let the sounds of medieval England, the clash of distant swords, the whisper of courtiers in stone corridors, and the prayers in candlelit chapels carry you gently toward the realm of dreams. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of history. We're so glad you found us. Now, let us begin our journey together, back through the mists of nearly 900 years, to a world both strange and strangely familiar, to a time when England's fate hung in the balance. Stephen, later known as King Stephen of England, was born into a world still fresh with the memory of conquest. To understand his story, we must first understand the world that shaped him, a world of Norman lords who had carved out kingdoms with their swords, a world where the Channel was not a barrier but a highway, connecting two halves of a single realm. The year was somewhere around 1092 or 1096. Historians cannot agree on the precise date, for in those times, the birth of even a count's son might go unrecorded if he seemed unlikely to inherit great power. Young Stephen entered the world not in England, the land he would one day rule so turbulently, but in France, in the county of Blois, a prosperous territory that sat astride important trade routes in the heart of what we now call the Loire Valley. The Norman world into which Stephen was born was barely a generation old in England. His grandfather, that towering figure we know as William the Conqueror, had crossed the Channel in 1066 and forever changed the face of England at a place called Hastings. By the time Stephen drew his first breath, William was already dead, killed by an injury suffered when his horse stumbled during a siege in France. The great conqueror's body, according to chroniclers of the time, had grown so large that it could barely fit into the stone coffin prepared for it, and when attendants tried to force it in, the corpse burst, filling the church with such a terrible stench that mourners fled, leaving the service unfinished. Such were the indignities that could await even the mightiest of warriors in that age. But William had left something more lasting than his mortal remains. He had left a complex inheritance that would shape the destiny of his descendants and, ultimately, lead to the chaos of Stephen's reign. The Norman conquest had not simply been a change of management. It had been a wholesale replacement of England's ruling class. Anglo-Saxon lords had been dispossessed and replaced with Norman nobles who spoke French, built stone castles, and owed their primary loyalty not to England, but to the Duke of Normandy. This created a unique political situation. England and Normandy were separate kingdoms, yet they were inextricably linked through their shared nobility. A baron might hold lands on both sides of the Channel, making him simultaneously a subject of the King of England and a vassal of the Duke of Normandy. When those two titles were held by the same person, all was well. But when they diverged, as they would during Stephen's reign, divided loyalties could tear the realm apart. Stephen's father was Count Stephen Henry of Blois, a man whose reputation would cast a long shadow over his son's life. Count Stephen Henry was wealthy, cultured, and by all accounts, an able administrator of his territories. But he had one fatal flaw that medieval chroniclers would never let his family forget. He was considered a coward. During the First Crusade, Count Stephen Henry had been among the great lords who answered Pope Urban II's call to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. He had journeyed all the way to the walls of Antioch in Syria, enduring months of hardship, disease, and battle. But when the siege of Antioch grew desperate, when the Crusaders found themselves starving and trapped between the city's walls and an approaching relief army, Count Stephen Henry had fled. He had abandoned his fellow Crusaders and made his way back to Europe, arriving home in disgrace. The shame of this desertion hung over the family like a dark cloud. So heavy was the dishonor that eventually, driven by his wife's reproaches and his own conscience, Count Stephen Henry would return to the east on another crusade. In 1102, when young Stephen was perhaps 10 years old, news reached France that his father had died at Ramla in Palestine, fighting the Muslims. Whether this death was an act of redemption or merely a final tragedy, the medieval mind saw it as God's judgment on a flawed man. But if Stephen's father bequeathed him a legacy of shame, his mother gave him something far more valuable. She gave him royal blood and powerful connections. Adela of Normandy was no ordinary countess. She was the daughter of William the Conqueror himself, making her a princess of the Norman realm. More than that, she was renowned throughout Christendom for her intelligence, her political acumen, and her forceful personality. After her husband's death, Adela effectively ruled Blois in her own right, making decisions about warfare, diplomacy, and governance that would normally have been reserved for men. She corresponded with popes and kings, advised her sons, and managed vast estates with a skill that earned her the respect even of those who believed women should remain in the domestic sphere. She was, in many ways, a woman ahead of her time, and she would live to see her son wear a crown, though whether she lived long enough to see that crown bring him more sorrow than joy, we cannot know. Adela ensured that her children received excellent educations. Stephen grew up speaking French as his native tongue, though he would later learn English and Latin. He studied the arts of warfare, learning to fight on horseback with lance and sword, to conduct sieges, and to command men in battle. But he also learned the softer arts, music, poetry, and the complex etiquette of the medieval court. He was taught to be charming, courteous, and generous, qualities that would serve him well in winning friends and allies, even if they would prove insufficient to hold a kingdom together. As the fourth son of Count Stephen Henry, young Stephen had no expectation of inheriting Blois. His eldest brother had died young, leaving the second son, Theobald, as heir to their father's French territories. Another brother, Henry, was destined for the church and would eventually become a bishop. What then was left for Stephen? A younger son with no inheritance. In the medieval world, such younger sons had limited options. They could become knights in the service of greater lords, hoping to win lands through loyal service or marriage. They could enter the church, rising through its ranks if they were clever and well connected. Or, if they were very fortunate, they could be taken in by a wealthy relative and raised at a great court, where opportunities for advancement might present themselves. For Stephen, this fortunate relative was his uncle, King Henry I of England. Henry, another of William the Conqueror's sons, had claimed the English throne in 1100 under circumstances that were, to say the least, suspicious. His older brother, King William Rufus, had died in a hunting accident in the New Forest when an arrow, supposedly shot by a companion, struck him in the chest. Whether this was truly an accident or a convenient assassination remained a matter of speculation. What was certain was that Henry, who had been present at the hunt, immediately rode to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned king before his eldest brother, Robert Curthose, could return from crusade to contest the throne. Henry had proved to be a capable, if ruthless, ruler. He was called Beauclerc, the good scholar, because of his education, an unusual distinction for a king. In an age when many nobles were illiterate, he established a sophisticated system of royal administration, bringing order to England's finances through an institution called the Exchequer. He subdued rebellious barons, reformed the legal system, and even conquered Normandy from his brother Robert, whom he imprisoned for life in Cardiff Castle, where Robert would languish in captivity for 28 years until his death. But for all his administrative genius, Henry had a famous weakness. He fathered an extraordinary number of illegitimate children. Some historians count over 20 bastard sons and daughters, and there may have been more. He acknowledged these children and provided for them generously, marrying his daughters to important nobles and giving his sons positions of power and wealth. This has led some modern historians to suggest that Henry deliberately used these children as a tool of diplomacy, creating a network of family connections that bound the Norman nobility to his throne. Into this court came young Stephen, probably in his teenage years. His mother, Adela, ever politically astute, had arranged for her son to be raised by his uncle the king. This was an enormous opportunity. At Henry's court, Stephen would meet the great men of the realm, learn statecraft, and most importantly, catch the eye of his uncle, who might grant him lands and position. Stephen thrived at his uncle's court. He possessed a natural charm that won him friends easily. He was brave in battle, generous with gifts, and possessed an easygoing manner that made even servants comfortable in his presence. Chronicles describe him as handsome, well-built, and athletic, qualities that mattered in an age when physical prowess was considered a sign of moral worth. He was the sort of man whom people naturally liked, the sort who could enter a room and immediately put everyone at ease. King Henry, pleased with his nephew's qualities, showered him with lands and honours. Stephen received extensive estates in England, making him one of the wealthiest barons in the kingdom. But Henry gave him something even more valuable. He arranged a marriage that would make Stephen's fortune. In 1125, when Stephen was in his late 20s or early 30s, Henry married him to Matilda of Boulogne. Now, here we must pause to acknowledge the confusion of names that will plague our story. There will be several Matildas in this tale. It was an extremely popular name among Norman nobility, much as there might be several Jennifers in a modern American high school. To keep them straight, remember that Stephen's wife was Matilda of Boulogne, while his rival for the throne was Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry. Matilda of Boulogne was an heiress in her own right. Her father was Count Eustace III of Boulogne, ruler of a strategically crucial territory on the French coast that controlled the shortest crossing point to England. When Eustace died, Matilda inherited the county, making her not just a countess by marriage, but a ruling countess in her own right. This marriage made Stephen enormously wealthy and strategically important. He now controlled estates in England, influence at the royal court, and access to a major port that could quickly move troops across the Channel. But more than wealth and power, Stephen found in Matilda a true partner. She was descended from the old Anglo-Saxon royal line through her mother, giving her impeccable bloodlines. She was intelligent, capable, and fiercely loyal. In the trials that lay ahead, when Stephen would face capture, defeat, and despair, it would be Matilda of Boulogne who would keep his cause alive. She would raise armies, negotiate with barons, and refuse to surrender even when all seemed lost. Medieval chroniclers, who rarely had kind words for women who exercised power, described her with respect and admiration. By 1135, as our story approaches its crucial turning point, Stephen had become one of the most prominent men in England. He was wealthy, well-connected, popular with both nobles and commoners, and close to King Henry. He had a beautiful wife, healthy children, and a secure position in the world. The future seemed bright, but beneath this pleasant surface, a crisis was building. A crisis that had its roots in a cold November night 15 years earlier, when a ship called the White Ship set sail from the Norman coast and never reached England's shores. That disaster, and King Henry's desperate attempts to solve the succession problem it created, would set in motion the events that would consume Stephen's life and plunge England into chaos. Let us return now to Stephen's earliest years, for in understanding the child, we may better understand the king he would become. The county of Blois, in the late 11th century, was a prosperous place, enriched by trade and agriculture. The town of Blois itself sat on the Loire River, that great waterway that flowed through the heart of France like a silvery ribbon. Merchants carried wine, salt, and grain along its waters, and the citizen Count's tolls on this commerce filled his coffers with silver pennies. Young Stephen grew up in a castle that overlooked this river, a structure of wood and stone perched on a hill, commanding views of the surrounding countryside. The castle would have been both his home and his fortress, a place where military necessity and domestic comfort intertwined. Great halls for feasting, smaller chambers for the family's privacy, stables for horses, armories for weapons, storerooms for provisions, and a chapel where the household would gather for daily prayers. All of these were part of Stephen's childhood landscape. As a child of nobility, Stephen's life was structured by the rituals and expectations of his class. He would have risen early, attending morning prayers in the chapel where candlelight flickered off stone walls, and the priest's Latin words washed over him in incomprehensible waves. Breakfast would have been simple: bread, perhaps some cheese, ale or watered wine. Then would come lessons. For a boy of noble birth, education meant learning to be a warrior and a lord. Stephen would have spent hours in the castle's courtyard, learning to handle weapons under the watchful eye of experienced knights. First, wooden swords, learning the basic cuts and parries. Then, as he grew older and stronger, real weapons, though perhaps slightly smaller and lighter than those a grown man would wield. He would have learned to ride, not just to sit on a horse, but to control a powerful war horse in battle, to guide it with his knees while his hands were occupied with weapons. He would have practiced with the quintin, a wooden dummy mounted on a rotating pole. A young knight would charge at it with a lance trying to strike the center. If he hit it incorrectly, the quintin would spin around and strike him with a sandbag, teaching him to strike true and spur his horse away quickly. it was both training and entertainment, and on long summer afternoons, the courtyard would ring with the shouts of boys and the laughter of knights watching their pupils. But Stephen's education was not merely martial. His mother Adela, that formidable woman, insisted that her sons learn to read and write, rare accomplishments for nobles in that age. Stephen learned Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship. He could read the Psalms, the Gospels, and the lives of saints. He probably learned at least some bits of classical literature, perhaps Virgil's Aeneid, that story of another exile who had founded a great kingdom. He learned music, for nobles were expected to provide entertainment at feasts and courts. He might have played the harp or the lute, might have sung songs of chivalry and courtly love. He learned the art of hunting with hawks and hounds, for hunting was not merely sport, but a crucial source of fresh meat, and a way for nobles to display their wealth and skill. Most importantly, he learned the complex web of etiquette, obligation, and honor that governed noble society. He learned how to pay proper respect to superiors, how to accept homage from inferiors, how to give gifts generously, for stinginess was considered shameful in a lord, and how to maintain the delicate balance of pride and humility that marked a true nobleman. The young Stephen apparently absorbed these lessons well. Chronicles describe him as affable and well-mannered, a man whom people naturally liked. He had the gift of making others feel valued and important. When he spoke to a knight, that knight felt heard. When he praised a servant's work, that servant glowed with pride. This was not mere manipulation. By all accounts, Stephen genuinely liked people and enjoyed their company. He would sit with his men at meals, laughing at their jokes, listening to their stories. He treated servants with a courtesy that surprised those accustomed to nobles, who viewed commoners as barely human. This easygoing nature would serve him well in winning friends and allies, but it would also prove to be a fatal flaw when kingship required him to make hard decisions, to choose between friends, to punish those who betrayed him. A king needed to be loved, but he also needed to be feared. Stephen would master the first, but never truly achieve the second. When Stephen was still young, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, the course of his life changed dramatically. His father, Count Stephen Henry, departed on his second crusade, still haunted by the shame of his earlier flight. News of his death at Ramla reached Blois in 1102, and suddenly the family dynamics shifted. Theobald, the eldest surviving son, became count. Henry was already destined for the church, but what of Stephen? It was then that his mother, Adela, made the arrangements that would determine his future. Through her connections as daughter of William the Conqueror, she approached her brother King Henry of England with a proposal. Would the king take young Stephen into his household, raising him at court and providing for his future? Henry agreed, and so Stephen crossed the Channel to England, leaving behind his French homeland for a kingdom that would become both his triumph and his torment. The exact year is uncertain, perhaps around 1106 or 1107, when Stephen would have been in his early teens. It was the perfect age for such a transition, old enough to have received basic education and training, young enough to still be molded by new influences. England must have seemed strange to the young French nobleman. The language was different. The common people spoke English, a tongue descended from the Anglo-Saxon that had been spoken before the Norman conquest. The landscape was different too. While France had its great river valleys and rolling countryside, England had its own character. Darker forests, more rain, a cooler climate. The architecture was different, with the massive stone keeps that Norman lords were building to dominate the conquered English countryside. But for a young man, with ambition and talent, the English court offered opportunities that provincial Blois could never match. King Henry's court was cosmopolitan and sophisticated. Here, Stephen met men who had fought in crusades, travelled to Rome, negotiated with emperors and kings. He met scholars who could debate theology and philosophy, warriors who had won fame on battlefields from Wales to Normandy, merchants who knew the price of pepper in Constantinople and silk in Alexandria. He also met his cousins, Henry's numerous children, both legitimate and illegitimate. Among these was Robert of Gloucester, King Henry's eldest bastard son, a man several years older than Stephen. Robert was being groomed for greatness despite his illegitimate birth. He was given the title Earl of Gloucester and granted extensive lands in the west of England. He was a formidable warrior, an able administrator, and utterly loyal to his father. He and Stephen moved in the same circles, probably considered each other friends. Neither could have known that one day they would be enemies, that Robert would lead armies against Stephen's forces, that their conflict would devastate the kingdom they both loved. Such is the tragic nature of civil war. It turns friends into foes and makes enemies of those who once broke bread together. Stephen also met his cousin Matilda, King Henry's legitimate daughter. She was several years younger than Stephen, and during these early years, she was not in England at all. At age 8, she had been sent to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, a diplomatic marriage arranged to strengthen England's position in European politics. She would live in Germany for years, learning the language, absorbing German customs, and eventually being crowned empress. The title would stick with her for the rest of her life, even after her husband's death. She would always be Empress Matilda, never merely Lady Matilda, and this pride in her imperial status would later cause her great trouble in England. But in these early years of Stephen's time at court, Matilda was far away, and no one yet imagined that she would return to claim her father's throne, or that Stephen would be the one to deny it to her. King Henry took a liking to his nephew. Stephen had all the qualities that a medieval king appreciated. He was brave, loyal, well-mannered, and decorative at court. He could be counted on to fight well in tournaments, to charm foreign ambassadors, to lead troops in minor campaigns. Most importantly, he seemed content with his position. He didn't scheme for power or plot against his uncle. He simply served faithfully and waited for rewards. Those rewards came. Henry granted Stephen lands in England, estates in East Anglia, properties in the Thames Valley, holdings scattered across the kingdom. Each grant came with an oath of loyalty, binding Stephen more tightly to his uncle and to England. By his mid-20s, Stephen was already wealthy in his own right, but the greatest reward came with his marriage to Matilda of Boulogne in 1125. This union made Stephen not merely wealthy, but strategically crucial. He now had a power base independent of his uncle's favour. He had a port through which armies could quickly cross from France to England. He had become a major player in the complex game of medieval politics. The marriage also seems to have been a happy one, rare in an age when noble marriages were political arrangements. Stephen and Matilda had several children together. Their sons Eustace and William would grow up in the shadow of their father's struggles for the throne. Their daughter, also named Matilda, would marry well and continue the family line. Another daughter, Mary, would eventually marry and have children who would carry Stephen's blood into future generations. Chronicles from the period give us glimpses of Stephen's character during these years before he became king. He was known for his generosity, even extravagance. He gave gifts freely, rewarded service lavishly, and never turned away those who came to him for help. This generosity won him friends and retainers, building a network of men who felt personally loyal to him. He was also known for his physical courage. In tournaments and in small skirmishes along England's borders, Stephen proved himself a capable warrior. He could fight on horseback with lance and sword, could endure the physical demands of wearing heavy armor, could command men in the chaos of battle, this bravery would serve him well in the wars to come, though courage alone would not be enough to save his kingdom. What Stephen lacked, though contemporaries did not yet realize it, was the ruthlessness that kingship required. He was too kind, too eager to please, too willing to give enemies second chances. He valued harmony over justice, preferred compromise to confrontation. These qualities made him an excellent courtier and a good friend, but they would make him a troubled king. By 1135, Stephen had reached his early 40s. He had lived at the English court for nearly 30 years. He had fought in his uncle's wars, attended countless councils, witnessed the machinery of royal government at work. He understood how power functioned in the Norman realm. He knew the important barons, had connections with the church hierarchy, was familiar with every corner of England and Normandy. He had become, in short, perfectly positioned to seize a throne if opportunity presented itself. All that was needed was for that throne to become vacant and for the succession to be uncertain. That opportunity was coming, though Stephen did not yet know it. The seeds had been planted 15 years earlier, on that cold November night when the White Ship went down. Now, those seeds were about to bear their bitter fruit. November 25th, 1120. The date would be seared into the memory of everyone who lived through it, a moment when history pivoted, when the future that seemed certain was suddenly cast into doubt. King Henry I had been in Normandy, conducting one of his regular campaigns to maintain control over his French territories. It had been a successful season. He had defeated his enemies in battle, captured important castles, and strengthened his position. Now, as winter approached, it was time to return to England. The court was at Barfleur, a small port town on the Norman coast, where the crossing to England was shortest. The mood was celebratory. Young nobles gathered, planning their return voyage. They had spent the evening drinking wine, lots of wine, for this was to be a celebration of victory. The king himself was taking one ship, but many of his courtiers and nobles would sail on a different vessel. That vessel was called the White Ship, the Blanche Neuf in French. It was newly refitted, fresh and clean, and supposedly the fastest ship in the fleet. Its captain was Thomas Fitzstephen, whose father had captained ships for William the Conqueror. Thomas was proud of his vessel and eager to prove its speed. He told the young nobles aboard that his White Ship would overtake the king's vessel, reaching England first, despite leaving later. The passengers gathered on board. This was the cream of Anglo-Norman nobility, about 300 people in total. Among them was William Adelin, King Henry's only legitimate son and heir to the throne of England. At 17 years old, William was everything a medieval prince should be: brave, handsome, well-educated, and popular with the nobles. His future seemed assured. He would marry father children, succeed his father as king, and continue the Norman dynasty. Also aboard were two of King Henry's illegitimate children, Richard of Lincoln and Matilda, Countess of Perche. These royal bastards had been acknowledged by Henry and married to important nobles. Richard was considered particularly capable, and some whispered that if anything happened to William, Henry might designate Richard as heir despite his illegitimate birth. The nobles were joined by dozens of others, knights, servants, sailors, and hangers-on. Nearly the entire younger generation of Anglo-Norman nobility crowded onto this one ship. It was a floating court, a celebration on water. King Henry, who was travelling on a different vessel, departed first. His ship raised its sails and moved out into the channel, heading for England. The White Ship remained at dock, and the drinking continued. Wine flowed freely, perhaps too freely. Both passengers and crew were celebrating. and the ship's departure was delayed as casks of wine were emptied. Finally, as darkness fell, dangerous in an age without modern navigation, the white ship prepared to leave. The drunken captain assured everyone that they would catch up to the king's vessel. Oars were manned, sails were raised, and the ship pushed away from the dock. Then the crew made a fateful decision to prove their ship's speed, to catch the king's vessel despite leaving. Hours late, they would take a shortcut, sailing close to shore rather than out in the safer deep water. In the gathering darkness, with everyone aboard at least somewhat intoxicated, the white ship accelerated toward disaster. Chroniclers tell us what happened next with the certainty of hindsight, though the exact details remain murky. In the darkness, the helmsman failed to see a rock just beneath the surface of the water. The rock was well known to local sailors. It was called Quillebeuf Rock, and experienced captains knew to avoid it. But Captain Thomas, drunk and eager to prove his ship's speed, either didn't see it or miscalculated his position. The white ship struck the rock with tremendous force. In an instant, the celebration turned to catastrophe. The rock tore a hole in the ship's hull, and water began pouring in. The vessel lurched violently, throwing passengers off their feet. Sails came crashing down. People began screaming. In the chaos and darkness, it was impossible to see what was happening or to coordinate any kind of rescue. The ship was sinking fast. Those who could try to scramble into the small boats carried aboard for emergencies, but there were hundreds of people and only a few small boats. Panic set in. Prince William Adelin, to his credit, responded with the courage expected of a prince. He managed to get into one of the small boats and began to row away from the sinking ship. He might have survived, but then, over the screams and confusion, he heard his half-sister Matilda crying for help. She was still on the sinking ship, trapped and terrified. The 17-year-old prince made a decision that chroniclers would later portray as both noble and tragic. He ordered his boat to turn back. He would not abandon his sister. The small boat rowed back toward the sinking white ship. But as William approached, dozens of desperate people saw their chance at survival. They grabbed for the boat, pulling themselves toward it, trying to climb aboard. Too many hands grabbed too many gunwales. The small boat, never designed to hold more than a handful of people, capsized. Prince William, his sister, and everyone else in the boat were plunged into the cold November waters of the English Channel. The temperature of the water that time of year would have been perhaps 45 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. Even strong swimmers, even those who managed to grab floating debris, would have had little chance. And remember that most medieval people could not swim at all. Heavy clothing, armor, and weapons pulled people down. Within minutes, the white ship had vanished beneath the waves. Nearly 300 people were cast into the freezing water. Their screams echoed across the channel for a time, then slowly faded into silence as, one by one, they succumbed to the cold. According to the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, there was only one survivor. His name was Berold, and he was a butcher from Rouen who had been aboard the ship on business. He managed to grab hold of the rock that had sunk the ship and clung to it throughout the night. His sheepskin coat, worn against the cold, provided just enough insulation to keep him alive. When dawn broke and fishermen came out, they found him barely conscious, still gripping the rock, the only living soul to tell what had happened. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen also survived the initial sinking. He came to the surface, gasping and flailing in the cold water. But when he asked those around him if Prince William had survived and learned that the prince had drowned, Thomas let himself sink back beneath the waves. He chose death rather than face King Henry with the news that he had killed the king's only son and heir. When King Henry reached England, he was in good spirits. pleased with his successful campaign in Normandy. He had no idea that disaster had struck. The first reports that reached him merely said that a ship had sunk. It was only gradually that the full horror of what had happened became clear. The White Ship had gone down. Prince William was dead. Richard of Lincoln was dead. Matilda of Perche was dead. Nearly the entire younger generation of the Anglo-Norman nobility was dead. Among the dead was Richard, Earl of Chester, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Geoffrey Riddell was gone. Dozens of knights whose names appear in charters and chronicles simply vanished from history in a single night. Entire families were wiped out. Fathers lost all their sons. The succession plans of dozens of noble houses were thrown into chaos. But most catastrophic of all was the loss of Prince William. King Henry, who had so carefully secured his throne, who had conquered Normandy and established stable government, who had everything under control, suddenly had no heir. His only legitimate son was dead. The man who brought Henry the news, a young nobleman who had not been on the White Ship, was so terrified of the king's reaction that he could not bring himself to speak directly. Instead, he knelt before Henry weeping. The king, seeing his distress, demanded to know what was wrong. The young man could only sob that Prince William was dead. Other courtiers had to confirm the terrible news. Chronicles tell us that King Henry collapsed when he understood what had happened. He fell to the ground as if struck by a physical blow. When his attendants helped him up, he could not speak. He withdrew to his private chambers, and for days, no one saw him. When he emerged, those around him noticed that he seemed to have aged decades in mere days. Some chroniclers, writing with the benefit of hindsight, claimed that Henry never smiled again after that day. Whether this is literally true, we cannot know. Medieval chroniclers often embellished their stories for dramatic effect, but there can be no doubt that the White Ship disaster changed Henry profoundly. The careful plans he had made for England's future were destroyed. Everything he had built suddenly seemed uncertain. The disaster also affected Stephen, though he was not directly involved. Stephen had been in England at the time, not Normandy, so he was not at Barfleur when the White Ship sailed. But the news that reached him must have been staggering. His cousins were dead. The prince he had known since childhood was gone. The entire succession was now in question. What went through Stephen's mind as he heard the news? Did he feel grief for the young people he had known who were now at the bottom of the channel? Certainly. Did he also feel a stirring of ambition, a recognition that the throne might now be within reach? Perhaps. We cannot read the hearts of men 900 years dead, but Stephen was neither stupid nor naively unambitious. He must have understood that English politics had fundamentally changed. King Henry's response to the disaster would set in motion the events that would lead to civil war. The king needed an heir. At 52 years old, Henry was still relatively young and healthy. He could remarry and try to father another son. And indeed, he did remarry, taking as his bride Adeliza of Louvain, a young and reportedly beautiful princess. But despite years of marriage, Henry and Adeliza had no children. Whether this was due to Henry's age, Adeliza's fertility, or simple bad luck, we cannot know. But the result was that Henry's only legitimate child was now his daughter Matilda, who was far away in Germany, married to the Holy Roman Emperor. The solution Henry eventually chose would prove disastrous. He decided that Matilda would be his heir, that England would, for the first time in its history, be ruled by a woman. To make this plan work, he would demand that all his barons swear oaths of loyalty to Matilda as his designated successor, and Stephen, along with everyone else at court, would be required to take that oath. Little did anyone know that this oath, sworn solemnly in the presence of God and the Church, would become the excuse for England's bloodiest civil war, a war that would pit cousin against cousin, A war that would make men question whether oaths meant anything at all. A war that would earn the name by which history remembers it. The Anarchy. The years following the White Ship disaster were years of growing tension, though at first this tension was hidden beneath the surface of orderly government. King Henry ruled on, trying to solve the problem of succession while maintaining the kingdom's stability. His first step was to remarry, as we have mentioned. In 1121, less than a year after the disaster, Henry married Adeliza of Louvain. She was young, barely 18 to Henry's 53 years, and came from a noble family in what is now Belgium. She was renowned for her beauty, and more importantly from the dynasty's perspective, came from a family known for its fertility. Henry hoped that she would give him sons, but month after month, year after year passed, and Adeliza did not become pregnant. In an age that knew nothing of biological fertility or genetics, this failure to produce children was often blamed on the woman. But Henry had fathered dozens of illegitimate children with various mistresses, proving that he was certainly capable of paternity. Whatever the reason, perhaps Henry's age, perhaps simply ill fortune, no children came from this marriage. This left Henry with a problem. His only legitimate child was his daughter Matilda, who was in Germany serving as Holy Roman Empress. In 1125, Empress Matilda's husband, Emperor Henry V, died of cancer. The 23-year-old Empress was suddenly a widow with no children of her own. The imperial throne passed to a rival claimant, and Matilda was left without a role in Germany. King Henry summoned his daughter home to England. She arrived in 1126, still calling herself Empress and insisting on the dignity and ceremony that title implied. She had lived in Germany for most of her life, from age 8 to 23. Germany had shaped her personality and expectations. She had witnessed the power and ceremony of the imperial court, one of the most prestigious in Christendom. She had been crowned Empress in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. She had acted as regent in Italy on behalf of her husband. Now she was being recalled to England, a kingdom that must have seemed provincial compared to the glories of Germany. The English court spoke French, not the German she had learned. The country was rainy and cold, and worst of all, her father had plans for her that she found distasteful. At Christmas 1126, King Henry gathered his barons for a great council. There he announced his decision. Since he had no legitimate son, and seemed unlikely to have one in the future, his daughter Matilda would be his heir. Upon his death, she would inherit the throne of England and the Duchy of Normandy. All the great nobles of the realm would swear an oath to recognize her as the rightful successor. This announcement caused considerable discomfort. England had never had a queen regnant, a woman who ruled in her own right rather than as the wife of a king. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before the Norman conquest had occasionally recognized female rulers, but this was different. England was now part of a larger Norman realm, and Norman custom did not readily accept female succession. Moreover, many nobles had reservations about Matilda personally. She was haughty and proud, insisting on the imperial dignity that she felt was her due. She seemed unwilling to bend, to compromise, to show the flexibility that English politics required. Some whispered that she looked down on the English and Norman nobles, considering them provincial compared to the German princes she had known. Nevertheless, the barons swore the oath. One by one they came forward and pledged their loyalty to Matilda as Henry's designated heir. Among them was Stephen. On his knees before his uncle and his cousin, Stephen swore that he would support Matilda's claim to the throne, that he would recognize her as rightful queen when King Henry died. It was a solemn moment, witnessed by the church and by the assembled nobility. Oaths mattered in medieval society. They were not merely promises. They were sacred bonds that carried spiritual consequences. To break an oath was to risk not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. The chronicles make clear that these barons understood the gravity of what they were doing. But oaths, however solemn, are only as strong as the circumstances that enforce them. And Henry knew that Matilda's position was precarious. A woman alone, without a husband, would struggle to command respect and loyalty from the warrior nobility. Matilda needed a husband, both to provide her with children who could continue the dynasty and to give her military support when Henry died. Henry chose Geoffrey of Anjou as Matilda's second husband. On the surface, this seemed like a good match. Geoffrey was the eldest son and heir of Count Fulk V of Anjou, one of the most powerful nobles in France. When his father abdicated to become king of Jerusalem, Geoffrey would inherit the wealthy and strategically important county of Anjou, which bordered Normandy to the south. But there were problems with this match, problems that would have lasting consequences. First, there was the matter of age. Geoffrey was 15 years old, just entering manhood. Matilda was 26, 11 years his senior. In an age when women typically married much younger than men, this age difference seemed unnatural. Second, there was history. Anjou and Normandy had been enemies for generations. The counts of Anjou had fought wars against the Norman dukes for decades before the conquest. Bitter memories remained on both sides. Many Norman nobles were horrified at the thought of their future queen marrying into an Angevin family. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was the matter of personality. Geoffrey was young, ambitious, and conscious of his status. He expected deference as the future Count of Anjou. Matilda was older, proud of her imperial title, and accustomed to being treated as an empress. Both were strong-willed. Both expected to dominate their relationship. It was a recipe for marital conflict. The marriage took place in 1128, and it was troubled from the start. Matilda, we are told, hated being married to a mere count after having been an empress. She considered it a demotion. Geoffrey, for his part, resented his wife's haughty manner and her tendency to remind him that she outranked him. Medieval chroniclers, who loved to gossip about royal marriages, reported that the couple argued constantly and sometimes even lived apart. In 1129, Matilda returned to her father in Normandy, leaving Geoffrey behind in Anjou. It appeared the marriage might fail completely, but King Henry, desperate to secure his succession, forced the couple to reconcile. In 1133, after 5 years of marriage, Matilda finally became pregnant. She gave birth to a son, naming him Henry after her father. This boy, the future King Henry II, was King Henry III's first legitimate grandchild. The old king was delighted. He ordered celebrations throughout his realm. Here, at last, was hope for the dynasty's future. Even if the Norman nobles were reluctant to accept a woman as ruler, perhaps they would accept her son. The child could be raised in England, educated to be king, and when the time came, he could take the throne with his mother as regent. But King Henry also knew that many nobles remained uncomfortable with Matilda's succession. In 1131, he summoned his barons again and made them renew their oaths to Matilda. This second oath ceremony was particularly significant because it occurred after Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey. Now the barons were not just swearing to accept Matilda as their queen. They were implicitly accepting that Geoffrey of Anjou would have some role in England's governance, and that Matilda's children by Geoffrey would eventually inherit the throne. Once again, Stephen swore the oath. So did most of the other great barons, though some only with reluctance. Robert of Gloucester, King Henry's eldest bastard son, swore despite his own possible claims. The bishops swore. The archbishop swore. England's succession appeared to be settled, but appearances, as events would prove, were deceptive. Oaths sworn in the king's presence, while the king's power ensured obedience, might not hold when that king was dead. Many barons who swore to support Matilda did so with private reservations, and one reservation stood above all others: the fear that Geoffrey of Anjou, as Matilda's husband, would use his wife's English crown to expand Angevin power, potentially subjugating Normandy and threatening the interests of the Norman nobility. As the years passed, tensions between King Henry and his daughter's family grew worse. Matilda and Geoffrey, now with multiple children, a second son named Geoffrey was born in 1134, and a third son, William, would arrive in 1136, began to press King Henry for concrete assurances. They wanted him to hand over key castles in Normandy to Matilda immediately, ensuring that she would have a power base when he died. They wanted formal recognition from the Norman nobility, separate from the oaths sworn in England. King Henry refused. He was willing to designate Matilda as his heir, but he was not willing to surrender any actual power while he lived. This refusal angered Geoffrey, who began to suspect that Henry might change his mind about the succession. Relations between father-in-law and son-in-law grew strained. Meanwhile, whispers circulated through the courts of England and Normandy. Some barons suggested that perhaps Stephen, as a male heir and grandson of William the Conqueror, would make a better ruler than Matilda. Others mentioned Theobald of Blois, Stephen's older brother, who also had royal blood. A few spoke of Robert of Gloucester, the capable bastard son who had proven his loyalty and skill many times over. These whispers never became open rebellion while Henry lived. The old king's reputation for ruthlessness kept dissent quiet, but everyone knew that when Henry died, the succession would be contested. Some barons began to position themselves, making quiet alliances, preparing for the possibility of civil war. Stephen himself gave no public sign of disloyalty. He continued to serve his uncle faithfully, attending court, witnessing charters, participating in military campaigns. He was wealthy, respected, and apparently content with his position. But we may reasonably wonder what went through his mind as he attended council meetings where Matilda's succession was discussed. Did he think himself a better candidate for the throne? Did his wife Matilda of Boulogne whisper ambitions in his ear? Did the nobles who approached him with careful, seemingly innocent questions about the succession plant seeds of ambition? We cannot know what Stephen thought during these years, but we know what he did when opportunity presented itself, and that action would change the course of English history. December 1st, 1135. King Henry I was hunting in the forest of Normandy, near a place called Lyon-la-Forêt. The morning had been cold, as early December mornings often were, and the hunting had been good. Henry had spent the day riding through the bare winter woods, following the hounds, enjoying the chase. He was 67 years old, an advanced age for medieval times, but still active and apparently healthy. That evening, the hunting party returned to the lodge. A feast was prepared, and among the dishes served was lamprey, a kind of eel that was considered a delicacy by medieval nobility. King Henry particularly loved lamprey, despite the fact that his physicians had warned him against eating it. The fish was rich, oily, and difficult to digest, and Henry's doctors felt it was unsuitable for a man of his age. But Henry ignored their warnings. He ate the lamprey with gusto, enjoying what would be his final meal. That night, he fell violently ill. His stomach cramped, he developed a fever, and he began vomiting. For a week, he lingered, growing steadily worse. His physicians tried every remedy they knew: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, prayers, but nothing helped. Henry's condition continued to deteriorate. On December 1st, King Henry I died. With him died any chance of a peaceful succession. The question of whether Henry truly died from eating bad lamprey, or whether he was poisoned, has intrigued historians for centuries. Some suspicious minds noted that Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, had been in Normandy at the time. Could he have poisoned the king to clear the way for Stephen? Most historians dismiss this as conspiracy theory. Henry was an old man who ate rich food against medical advice and died of food poisoning or perhaps appendicitis. Sometimes history really is that simple. But whether the death was natural or not, what mattered was what happened next. King Henry's body was prepared for burial according to medieval custom. In an age without embalming, this was a gruesome process. The internal organs were removed to slow decomposition. The body was covered in salt and wrapped in ox hides. It would eventually be transported to Reading Abbey in England, where Henry had requested burial. But all of this would take time. Meanwhile, news of the king's death spread rapidly across Normandy and toward England. And here is where our story takes its crucial turn. Empress Matilda was in Anjou with her husband Geoffrey when her father died. They were not at the deathbed. They were not in Normandy at all. They were more than 100 miles away in Geoffrey's territories to the south. Some historians believe this absence was no accident. Relations between Henry and Geoffrey had been strained, as we have mentioned. Perhaps Henry had deliberately kept his daughter and son-in-law at a distance, or perhaps Geoffrey, sensing that the old king was dying, had chosen to stay away, not wanting to be present at the moment of death when questions about the succession would immediately arise. Whatever the reason, Matilda's absence from Normandy at the moment of her father's death would prove catastrophic to her cause. In medieval politics, timing was everything. The first claimant to reach the center of power and secure recognition often won, regardless of what oaths had been sworn or what the deceased king's wishes had been. And in this race to claim the throne, Stephen of Blois moved with impressive speed. Stephen was in Boulogne when he received news of his uncle's death. He was with his wife Matilda, perhaps discussing the future, perhaps already making plans. We do not know if Stephen had been contemplating seizing the throne before Henry's death, or if the decision was made spontaneously when opportunity presented itself. What we do know is that he acted with remarkable decisiveness. Within hours of receiving the news, Stephen was moving. He and a small group of trusted knights rowed hard for the coast. They took ship at Wissant, the closest port to England, crossing the channel in winter weather that must have made the voyage uncomfortable and dangerous. But Stephen pressed on. Every hour mattered. Every delay gave potential rivals time to organize. Stephen landed at Dover and immediately rode for London. He was gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. If the English nobility rejected his claim, he would be branded an oath-breaker and a traitor. If the church refused to crown him, he would have no legitimacy. If his brother barons chose to honor their oaths to Matilda, he would be defeated before he began. But Stephen understood something crucial about political power. Possession is 9/10 of reality. If he could get himself crowned quickly, if he could present the nobility with a fait accompli, many would accept him rather than face the uncertainty and danger of civil war. London was the key. The city was England's commercial heart, its wealthiest and most populous settlement. Since ancient times, London had claimed a traditional role in making kings. The citizens of London, through their leaders, would elect the king, a ceremony that gave legitimacy to the new ruler. It was largely symbolic. The real power lay with the great barons and the church, but it mattered. Stephen reached London on December 15th, just 2 weeks after his uncle's death. He went immediately to the city's leaders and made his case. He claimed that King Henry, on his deathbed, had changed his mind about the succession. The dying king, Stephen said, had released his barons from their oaths to Matilda and had designated Stephen as his heir instead. Was this true? Almost certainly not. The only witness Stephen could produce for this deathbed change of heart was Hugh Bigod, a baron who had been present when Henry died. Hugh swore that Henry had indeed designated Stephen as heir, but Hugh was a known ally of Stephen, and most historians believe he was lying. No other witnesses corroborated the story. If Henry had truly changed his mind about something as important as the succession, surely he would have made the announcement formally with multiple witnesses from the church and nobility. But true or not, the story served Stephen's purpose. It gave the nobility an excuse to break their oaths to Matilda without admitting they were oath breakers. They could claim that King Henry himself had released them from their pledges. London's leaders agreed to support Stephen. They acclaimed him as king in a ceremony that had ancient roots. With London's support secured, Stephen moved on to Winchester, the old capital of Anglo-Saxon England, and still one of the kingdom's most important cities. Winchester was governed by Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, who was Bishop of Winchester. Henry was one of the most powerful men in England. As a bishop, he controlled vast church lands and revenues. As the brother of a potential king, he had everything to gain from Stephen's success. Henry threw his full support behind his brother. More importantly, Henry controlled the royal treasury, which was kept at Winchester Castle. He opened the treasury to Stephen, providing him with the gold and silver needed to pay supporters and hire soldiers. Money was the lifeblood of medieval politics. With Winchester's treasury behind him, Stephen could afford to be generous, rewarding those who supported him and buying the loyalty of those who wavered. But Stephen still needed one more thing to make his kingship legitimate. He needed the church's approval. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William of Corbeil, was the senior churchman in England. His blessing would be crucial. Archbishop William was in a difficult position. He had sworn an oath to support Matilda, but he also recognized political reality. Stephen was here in England with support and money. Matilda was far away in Anjou, pregnant with her third child, unable to travel quickly. If William refused to crown Stephen, civil war would almost certainly follow, and the church would bear some of the blame. Moreover, Stephen's supporters presented the archbishop with arguments that gave him cover for breaking his oath. They emphasized that Matilda had married Geoffrey of Anjou without the consent of the English barons, which they claimed violated the terms under which the original oath had been sworn. They repeated the story about King Henry's deathbed change of heart. They reminded the archbishop that England had never had a queen regnant, and that accepting a woman as ruler would be dangerous and unprecedented. After what must have been anguished deliberation, Archbishop William agreed to crown Stephen. Perhaps he genuinely believed that Stephen would make a better king than Matilda. Perhaps he simply bowed to political necessity. Or perhaps he was swayed by Stephen's promises. Stephen swore that he would respect the church's rights and privileges, that he would be a just and pious king, that he would defend the realm against its enemies. On December 22nd, 1135, just 3 weeks after King Henry's death, Stephen was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony followed the ancient rituals. Stephen swore oaths to uphold the law, protect the church, and govern justly. The archbishop anointed him with holy oil, making him sacred in the eyes of God and the church. The crown of England was placed upon Stephen's head. It was done. Stephen was king. The speed of his actions had been remarkable. In 3 weeks, he had crossed from France to England, secured London's support, gained access to the treasury, won over the church, and been crowned. It was a political masterpiece of timing and decisiveness, but it was also, unquestionably, a usurpation. Stephen had broken his oath to Matilda. He had claimed a throne that his uncle had explicitly denied him. He had taken advantage of Matilda's absence and inability to respond quickly. He had presented the nobility with a choice between accepting him or plunging immediately into civil war, and many nobles, faced with that choice, chose to accept him. One by one, the great barons came to Stephen's court and swore their loyalty. Some did so enthusiastically, believing that Stephen would make a better king than Matilda. Others did so reluctantly, feeling they had no choice. A few, including Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother, held back, not openly rebelling, but also not committing themselves fully to Stephen's cause. Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, crossed to England and was crowned beside her husband at Easter 1136, in a ceremony that emphasized the new regime's legitimacy. She brought with her troops from Boulogne and its allied territories, providing Stephen with additional military strength. Throughout the trials ahead, Queen Matilda would prove to be Stephen's most capable and loyal supporter. But even as Stephen consolidated his position in England, ominous signs appeared. In Normandy, the situation was chaotic. Many Norman barons refused to recognize Stephen as duke, preferring to wait and see what Matilda would do. Geoffrey of Anjou saw opportunity and began raiding into Normandy, claiming he was acting on behalf of his wife's rights. David, King of Scots and Matilda's uncle, invaded northern England, claiming he was supporting his niece's rightful claim to the throne. Stephen responded to these threats with the energy and courage that were his greatest assets. He marched north with an army to confront King David. The two forces met, negotiated, and reached a temporary peace. David withdrew from most of the territory he had seized, though he kept control of Carlisle and Newcastle. It was not a complete victory, but it prevented immediate war with Scotland. In Normandy, the situation was more complicated. Stephen crossed the Channel with an army and attempted to assert his authority over the duchy. Some Norman barons accepted him, others resisted, and still others remained neutral, waiting to see who would ultimately prevail. Geoffrey of Anjou continued his raids, slowly nibbling away at Normandy's southern frontier. Stephen found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, trying to hold together a realm that was beginning to fracture. Yet, despite these challenges, Stephen's first 2 years as king were relatively successful. He was popular with many of the common people, who saw him as generous and accessible. He held court in London, York, and Winchester, showing himself to his subjects. He issued charters granting privileges to towns and monasteries. He dispensed justice and heard petitions. He did the things that kings were expected to do. But beneath this surface stability, problems were accumulating. Stephen had made promises to too many people, promises that contradicted each other. He had sworn to the church that he would respect its rights, but he also needed to control strategic castles that belonged to bishops. He had promised the barons that he would govern justly and not arbitrarily seize their lands, but he also needed to reward his supporters with estates confiscated from Matilda's adherents. Most seriously, Stephen had a fatal flaw in his character that would become increasingly apparent as his reign progressed. He was too kind, too forgiving, too eager to please everyone. When barons betrayed him, he would often pardon them and restore their lands, hoping to win their future loyalty. When he needed to make hard decisions, he would sometimes waver, trying to find compromises that satisfied no one. His generosity, which had made him popular as a nobleman, became a weakness as a king. A king needed to be feared as well as loved. He needed to be capable of ruthless action when necessary. Henry I had understood this. He had blinded and castrated traitors, imprisoned his own brother for life, and ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a glove of administrative efficiency. Stephen, by contrast, seemed unable or unwilling to employ such methods. He wanted everyone to like him, and this desire would cost him dearly. As 1137 turned to 1138, the situation began to deteriorate. Robert of Gloucester, who had held back from openly supporting either Stephen or Matilda, finally made his decision. In June 1138, Robert formally renounced his allegiance to Stephen and declared his support for Empress Matilda. This was a devastating blow. Robert was not just any baron. He was King Henry's son, Matilda's half-brother, and one of the most capable military commanders in England. He controlled extensive lands in the west of England and had a personal following of knights loyal to him. Robert's defection was the signal for others to act. Barons who had been waiting to see which way the wind blew now began to declare for Matilda. The kingdom was dividing into factions, and the stage was being set for civil war. Stephen tried to respond decisively. He marched to the west, attempting to subdue Robert's territories before the rebellion could spread. He besieged castles, raided estates, and tried to intimidate Robert's supporters. But Robert was not in England. He had withdrawn to Normandy, where he was coordinating with Geoffrey of Anjou and preparing for a major campaign. And in Anjou, Empress Matilda waited. She had given birth to her third son, another William, and she was preparing to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. She had not forgotten her father's designation or the oaths the barons had sworn. She had spent 3 years watching Stephen rule England, and she was determined to take it from him. The Anarchy was about to begin in earnest. The civil war that would devastate England for the next 15 years was gathering momentum, and Stephen, who had seized the throne with such speed and decisiveness, was about to discover that claiming a crown was far easier than keeping it. The years from 1136 to 1139 were a period of increasing chaos, as Stephen struggled to maintain control over a kingdom that was slowly slipping from his grasp. These were not yet the years of full-scale civil war, but they were years of mounting tension, of baronial rebellions, of Welsh raids and Scottish invasions, of Stephen rushing from crisis to crisis, never quite able to establish the stability that successful kingship required. One of Stephen's first major challenges came from Wales. The Welsh princes, who had been subdued and marginalised under the iron rule of King Henry, saw opportunity in Stephen's contested succession. Along the Welsh marches, the borderlands between England and Wales, Norman lords had built castles and established control over territories that the Welsh considered their own. Now, with a new king whose authority was questionable, the Welsh struck back. In 1136, a Welsh revolt began in the south. The rebels attacked Norman castles, raided English settlements, and killed several important marcher lords. Stephen responded by leading an army into Wales, campaigning in difficult terrain against an enemy that excelled at guerrilla warfare. He achieved limited success, capturing some castles and forcing some Welsh princes to submit. But he could not remain in Wales indefinitely, and when he withdrew, the Welsh simply rose up again. This pattern would repeat throughout Stephen's reign. He would respond to a crisis, seem to resolve it, then move on to another crisis, only to find that the first problem had returned. He was constantly racing from one end of the kingdom to the other, putting out fires but never achieving lasting solutions. In 1137, another threat emerged. King David of Scotland, who had nominally made peace with Stephen, invaded northern England again. David had multiple motives. He was Empress Matilda's uncle and genuinely believed she had a better claim to the throne than Stephen. He also saw opportunity to seize English territory for Scotland, and he had personal grievances. His son Henry had been promised lands in northern England that Stephen had not delivered. The Scottish invasion was serious. David's army pushed deep into Yorkshire, burning villages, capturing castles, and extracting tribute from terrified English towns. Chronicles describe the brutality of this campaign, with Scottish soldiers killing civilians and carrying off plunder. English refugees fled south, bringing tales of devastation. Stephen marched north again, gathering an army as he went. But before he could engage David's forces, his wife, Queen Matilda, intervened. She met with King David and negotiated a settlement. Under the Treaty of Durham, David would withdraw from most of the territory he had seized, but he would keep control of Carlisle and Cumberland. Additionally, David's son Henry would receive lands in England, including the important county of Huntingdon. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. David had gained valuable territory. Stephen's supporters felt he had shown weakness by negotiating rather than fighting. And most problematically, the powerful northern Baron Ranulph, Earl of Chester, was furious. Ranulph believed that he had traditional rights to Carlisle and Cumberland through his mother's inheritance. By giving those territories to the Scots, Stephen had made an enemy of one of England's most powerful nobles, but at least the Scottish threat was contained for the moment. Stephen turned his attention to other problems. Throughout 1137 and 1138, small rebellions flared across the kingdom. Individual barons would declare independence, fortify their castles, and defy royal authority. Stephen would march to confront them, besiege their castles, and force their submission. But as soon as he moved on, they would rebel again. Part of the problem was that Stephen's personality made him ill-suited to the role of disciplinarian. When he captured rebellious barons, he would often pardon them, hoping to win their gratitude and future loyalty. He would restore their lands, sometimes even give them additional honors, all in an attempt to transform enemies into friends. But this generosity was interpreted as weakness. Barons learned that they could rebel against Stephen with little risk of serious punishment. A particularly damaging incident occurred in 1139, involving the bishops of Salisbury, Lincoln, and Ely. These three churchmen, Roger of Salisbury and his nephews Alexander of Lincoln and Nigel of Ely, had been prominent in King Henry's government. They controlled important castles and possessed great wealth. Stephen suspected, probably correctly, that they were sympathetic to Matilda's cause. At a royal council, a fight broke out between the Bishop of Salisbury's men and some of Stephen's supporters. Using this incident as a pretext, Stephen arrested the three bishops and demanded that they surrender their castles. When they refused, Stephen threatened to starve them into submission. The bishops eventually yielded their castles, and Stephen garrisoned them with his own men. This seemed like decisive action. Stephen had moved against potential enemies and secured strategic fortresses. But it was also a political disaster. The church was outraged at the treatment of bishops. Even Stephen's own brother, Bishop Henry of Winchester, who was also papal legate in England, felt that Stephen had gone too far. The principle of clerical immunity, the idea that churchmen should not be subject to arrest by secular authorities, had been violated. The incident damaged Stephen's relationship with the church, which had been one of his key sources of support. It also alienated moderate barons who felt that Stephen had acted arbitrarily, arresting the bishops without clear legal cause. The arrests accomplished their immediate goal of securing castles, but they created resentment that would have long-term consequences. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Normandy, the situation was deteriorating. Geoffrey of Anjou, acting in his wife Matilda's name, had launched a systematic campaign to conquer the duchy. Geoffrey was a capable military commander, and he employed a patient strategy. Rather than seeking decisive battles, he slowly captured castles one by one, expanding Angevin control gradually but relentlessly. Stephen tried to defend Normandy, crossing the Channel with armies on multiple occasions, but he faced an impossible strategic situation. He could not be in two places at once. When he was in Normandy, problems erupted in England. When he was in England, Geoffrey made gains in Normandy. The twin kingdom that William the Conqueror and Henry I had held together was pulling apart. By 1139, significant portions of Normandy had fallen to Geoffrey. Many Norman barons, seeing the writing on the wall, switched their allegiance to Matilda. Others tried to remain neutral, paying homage to whoever controlled their immediate region. The unified Anglo-Norman realm was fragmenting, and Stephen seemed unable to prevent it. It was against this background of mounting crises that Empress Matilda finally made her move. She had been waiting for the right moment, and by 1139, that moment had arrived. Robert of Gloucester had prepared the ground, building a network of supporters in England. Geoffrey had secured much of Normandy, providing a base of operations, and Stephen had weakened himself through his handling of various crises. In September 1139, Empress Matilda landed in England. She came with a small force, about 140 knights, landing at the port of Arundel on the south coast. She was welcomed by Adeliza of Louvain, King Henry's widow, who was now married to William d'Aubigny, the Lord of Arundel Castle. Adeliza's support for Matilda showed that even those close to King Henry believed Matilda was the rightful heir. When Stephen learned that Matilda had landed at Arundel, he faced a crucial decision. Should he immediately march to Arundel, besiege the castle, and capture his rival? Matilda's force was small. She was isolated in a coastal fortress, cut off from her main supporters in the west. This might be Stephen's best chance to end the succession dispute before it turned into full-scale war. Stephen did march to Arundel. He arrived with an army and prepared to besiege the castle. But then he made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. Instead of attacking, Stephen negotiated. He agreed to allow Matilda to leave Arundel safely and travel to join her brother Robert of Gloucester in the west. He gave her a safe conduct pass. Why did Stephen do this? Various explanations have been suggested. Perhaps he was advised by his brother Henry, who wanted to avoid besieging a castle held by a dowager queen and protected by the church's neutrality. Perhaps Stephen felt it would be unchivalrous to attack women. Perhaps he believed that it would be better to face Matilda and Robert together in open warfare rather than to besiege Arundel, which might become a long and costly operation. Or perhaps, and this is the explanation that many historians favor, Stephen simply made a catastrophic error in judgment. His kindness and courtesy, his desire to resolve conflicts without bloodshed, his reluctance to take hard action, all of these led him to let his greatest enemy escape when he had the chance to capture her. Matilda travelled west under Stephen's safe conduct and joined Robert of Gloucester at Bristol Castle. Bristol was one of the strongest fortresses in England, built on a hilltop overlooking the River Avon. It would become Matilda's headquarters, the base from which she would conduct her campaign for the throne. As Matilda settled into Bristol, other nobles began to declare for her cause. Miles of Gloucester, a powerful marcher lord, threw his support behind the Empress. Brian Fitzcount, who held Wallingford Castle on the Thames, became one of her most loyal supporters. In the southwest, several important barons joined her faction. England was now clearly divided into two camps. The east and southeast supported Stephen. The west and southwest supported Matilda. The Midlands and north were contested territory, with some barons supporting each side and others trying to remain neutral. The country was sliding toward full-scale civil war. The period that contemporaries would call the 19 long winters when Christ and his saints were asleep was beginning. England was about to experience violence, destruction, and chaos on a scale not seen since the Danish invasions of the Anglo-Saxon period. And at the center of this storm stood Stephen, a man who had seized a throne with remarkable decisiveness, but who seemed increasingly unable to hold on to it. His generosity had won him friends but also bred contempt. His courage in battle was undeniable, But courage alone could not win a civil war. His desire to please everyone left him trusted by no one. The anarchy was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and both Stephen and Matilda would discover that civil war is easy to start, but nearly impossible to stop, that it creates its own momentum, destroying everything in its path until both sides are exhausted and desperate for peace. To understand the civil war that was now beginning, we must understand Empress Matilda herself, the woman who would be Stephen's great rival, who would come tantalizingly close to claiming the throne, and whose son would ultimately succeed where she failed. Matilda was born in February 1102, the first child of King Henry VI and his wife Matilda of Scotland. She was named after her mother, continuing a tradition that would create centuries of confusion for historians. From the moment of her birth, she was a princess, born into one of the most powerful royal families in Christendom. Her early childhood was spent in England, at her father's court. She would have received the education appropriate to a royal princess, lessons in reading and writing, religious instruction, music, and the elaborate etiquette of court life. But her childhood was cut short when, at the age of 8, she was sent to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor. Imagine being 8 years old and being told you are leaving your home, your parents, your country, probably forever. Imagine being sent across Europe to marry a man you have never met, a man 30 years older than you. This was Matilda's fate, and it shaped everything that came after. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry V was looking for a powerful alliance, and marriage to the daughter of the King of England fit his needs. Young Matilda was sent to Germany in 1110, where she spent her formative years learning German, adapting to German customs, and preparing to be empress. The marriage was finally celebrated in 1114, when Matilda was 12 years old. 2 years later, in 1116, she travelled to Italy with her husband for his coronation. In Rome, at St. Peter's Basilica, the most sacred church in Christendom, Matilda was crowned Holy Roman Empress by the Pope. She was 14 years old. This experience left an indelible mark on her personality. She had been crowned empress in one of the most magnificent ceremonies medieval Europe could produce. She had witnessed the power and prestige of the imperial court, one of the greatest in the world. She had acted as regent in Italy on her husband's behalf, making decisions about governance and administration. She had been treated with the reverence due to an empress. And then, abruptly, it ended. Emperor Henry V died in 1125, and Matilda was a widow at 23. The imperial crown passed to a rival claimant. Matilda was no longer empress of a vast territory. She was merely the daughter of the King of England, summoned home like a daughter whose marriage alliance had expired. This sudden fall from such heights must have been devastating. Matilda returned to England in 1126, but she never stopped calling herself empress. For the rest of her life, she insisted on that title. She insisted on the ceremony and dignity that she felt her imperial status demanded, and this insistence would cause her enormous problems in England. When her father declared her his heir in 1126, Matilda probably felt it was her due. She was King Henry's legitimate child. She had royal blood from both parents. Her father was Norman. Her mother was descended from the old Anglo-Saxon royal house. She had proven herself capable of governance during her time in Germany. Why should she not be queen? But the English and Norman nobility saw things differently. To them, Matilda seemed proud, arrogant, and foreign. She had spent most of her life in Germany and seemed to look down on English and French nobles as provincial. She demanded forms of ceremony appropriate to an empress rather than adapting to English customs. She showed little warmth or charm, presenting instead a cold formality that made people uncomfortable. When her father arranged her second marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, Matilda was furious. After being Holy Roman Empress, She was now being married to a mere count, and a count from an enemy family at that. Geoffrey was young, 11 years her junior, and while he would later prove himself a capable ruler and military commander, in 1128 he was just 15 years old, barely more than a boy. The marriage was troubled from the start. Matilda and Geoffrey argued constantly. She reportedly called him a mere count and reminded him of her imperial dignity. He resented her haughty manner and her tendency to treat him as inferior. They lived apart for extended periods. Only their father-in-law King Henry's insistence forced them to remain married. But despite their marital difficulties, Matilda and Geoffrey had children. Their first son, Henry, was born in Miditim 1133. Two more sons followed, Geoffrey in 1134 and William in 1136. These children would prove crucial to Matilda's cause. Even English nobles who could not accept a woman as ruler might accept her young son, with Matilda serving as regent. When Matilda learned that Stephen had seized the throne in December 1135, she was pregnant with William and could not immediately respond. She had to wait, recovering from childbirth, nursing her infant, and planning her countermove. This delay allowed Stephen to consolidate his position, but it did not diminish Matilda's determination. By 1139, Matilda was ready. She'd spent 4 years building support, coordinating with her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, and waiting for the right moment. When she finally landed in England in September of that year, she came not just to reclaim her inheritance, but to assert what she saw as her God-given right to rule. Her landing at Arundel and Stephen's puzzling decision to let her go to Bristol has already been described. Once established at Bristol Castle, Matilda began to act like a ruler in waiting. She held court, received homage from supporters, issued charters in her own name, and styled herself Lady of the English, Domina Anglorum in Latin. She never claimed to be queen, since that would require coronation, but she made clear that she considered herself the rightful sovereign. Matilda's supporters were a diverse group. Some, like Robert of Gloucester, supported her out of family loyalty. Robert was her half-brother and had loved their father, King Henry. He believed Matilda was the rightful heir, and that supporting her was honouring his father's wishes. Others supported her because they had quarrelled with Stephen, or felt he had treated them unjustly. Still others supported her simply because they saw advantage in doing so. By backing Matilda, they might win rewards if she succeeded. But Matilda also faced serious disadvantages. As a woman, she was viewed with suspicion by many nobles who believed that warfare and governance required masculine qualities. Her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou was deeply unpopular among Norman nobles, who remembered generations of warfare between Normandy and Anjou. Her personality, proud, formal, uncompromising, won her respect, but not affection. Chronicles describe her as intelligent, well-educated, and politically astute. She understood power and how to use it, but they also describe her as harsh, demanding, and unwilling to bend. Where Stephen was too soft, Matilda was too hard. Where he sought to please everyone, she seemed to care little whether anyone liked her. She expected obedience as her due, and had little patience for those who questioned her authority. This fundamental difference in personality would shape the Civil War. Stephen would forgive enemies and try to win them over, only to be betrayed again. Matilda would refuse to compromise, alienating potential allies even when concessions might have served her cause. Neither approach was entirely successful, and the conflict would drag on for years as a result. During late 1139 and through 1140, the two sides maneuvered for advantage without a decisive confrontation. Stephen controlled most of the east, including London, the richest city, and the symbolic heart of the kingdom. Matilda controlled much of the west, with Bristol as her capital. In the contested middle ground, castles changed hands, local lords switched sides, and small skirmishes flared without resolving the larger conflict. Both sides engaged in what military historians call attrition warfare, rather than seeking decisive battles, which were rare in medieval warfare and risky for both sides. They conducted sieges, raids, and economic warfare. Stephen would besiege a castle held by Matilda's supporters, starving out the garrison and capturing the fortress. Matilda's forces would raid Stephen's territories, burning villages and seizing plunder. Each side tried to exhaust the other's resources and will to fight. The common people of England suffered terribly during this period. Armies needed to be fed, and medieval armies typically lived off the land, taking food from peasants by force. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and livestock was slaughtered or stolen. Farmers who had managed to store grain for winter watched helplessly as soldiers seized it. Women and children fled their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. The chronicles of the period paint a grim picture. One monk at Peterborough Abbey wrote that men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep, because God seemed to have abandoned England to chaos. Another chronicle describes how local lords built unauthorized castles, called adulterine castles, because they were built without royal permission, like illegitimate children, from which they terrorized the surrounding countryside, demanding tribute from peasants and torturing those who could not pay. But despite the suffering and chaos, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Stephen controlled London and the royal treasury, giving him financial resources, but Matilda had the support of several powerful barons and controlled key fortresses. The kingdom was essentially stalemated. Then, in early 1141, the stalemate was broken by a dramatic event that seemed to change everything. A great battle was fought, the only major pitched battle of the entire Civil War. And in that battle, King Stephen was defeated and captured. For a brief moment, it seemed that Matilda had won. The crown was within her grasp. England might finally have its first queen regnant. But as events would prove, winning a battle and winning a war are two very different things. And Matilda's personality, which had sustained her through years of struggle, was about to become her greatest liability. The year 1140 was a time of increasing violence as the Civil War escalated from isolated skirmishes into more organized campaigns. Both Stephen and Matilda were building their strength, recruiting allies, and preparing for larger conflicts. The country was dividing more clearly into two camps, though many barons tried to maintain neutrality, switching sides as circumstances changed. Stephen spent much of 1140 campaigning in the Midlands, trying to extend his control into the contested territory between his eastern stronghold and Matilda's western base. He besieged castles, accepted the submission of wavering barons, and attempted to project an image of royal authority. But each success was partial and temporary. As soon as he moved on to the next challenge, his gains would erode. One significant event of 1140 was the defection of Nigel, Bishop of Ely, to Matilda's cause. Nigel was one of the bishops Stephen had arrested in 1139, and despite being released, he clearly nursed a grudge. Nigel established himself in the Isle of Ely, a marshy region surrounded by fens that was difficult to attack. From this base, he could raid into the surrounding countryside and threaten Stephen's control of East Anglia. Stephen responded quickly, surprising Nigel with a sudden attack on Ely. The bishop barely escaped with his life, fleeing to Gloucester to join Matilda. It was a victory for Stephen, but it came at a cost. One more bishop alienated, one more potential mediator lost. The church, which had initially supported Stephen's coronation, was becoming increasingly divided. Meanwhile, Geoffrey of Anjou was making steady progress in Normandy. By the end of 1140, He controlled much of the duchy, and more Norman barons were recognizing Matilda as their duchess. This was strategically important because Norman territories provided resources, money, soldiers, supplies that could be used to support Matilda's campaign in England. The winter of 1140–1141 was harsh, as medieval winters often were. Armies typically did not campaign during the coldest months, when movement was difficult and keeping troops supplied was nearly impossible. Both sides waited for spring, gathering their strength for the campaigns to come. Then, in late 1140, a crisis developed in the north that would lead to the most dramatic event of the entire Civil War. Ranulph, Earl of Chester, that powerful northern baron, who had been angered by Stephen's grant of Carlisle and Cumberland to the Scots, decided to seize Lincoln Castle. Lincoln was a strategically important city in eastern England. It sat on the Roman road called Ermine Street, controlling north-south movement through the region. Its castle was strong, built on a hill overlooking the city and the surrounding countryside. Whoever controlled Lincoln controlled much of the East Midlands. Ranulph employed trickery to capture the castle. He arranged for his wife and brother to visit the castle as guests, with a small escort. Once they were inside, Ranulph himself arrived with just a few knights, supposedly to escort his wife home. The castle's garrison, not suspecting treachery, let them in. Once inside, Ranulph and his men drew their weapons, overpowered the surprised garrison, and seized control of the castle. It was a bloodless coup, accomplished through deception rather than force, and it was a direct challenge to Stephen's authority. Lincoln was in Stephen's territory, far from Matilda's base in the west. If Ranulph could seize a major castle in the heart of Stephen's realm and get away with it, Stephen's kingship would be shown as hollow. The citizens of Lincoln, loyal to Stephen, sent urgent messages to the king. Stephen responded with characteristic speed and courage. He gathered an army and marched to Lincoln. Arriving in early January 1141, he established a siege, preparing to starve out Ranulph and his garrison. But Ranulph, recognizing that he could not hold the castle alone, had already escaped. He rode to his father-in-law, Robert of Gloucester, and made a deal. Ranulph would switch his allegiance to Empress Matilda if Robert would help him keep Lincoln. Robert agreed. This was too good an opportunity to miss. If they could defeat Stephen in battle, if they could capture or kill the king, the war might be won in a single stroke. Robert gathered an army from Matilda's supporters in the west. He was joined by Welsh troops from Powys, led by Prince Madog ap Maredudd. Other supporters contributed knights and soldiers. Within weeks, Robert had assembled a significant force and began marching toward Lincoln. Stephen, besieging the castle, received news that Robert's army was approaching. His advisors urged him to withdraw. His forces were outnumbered. Robert's army was fresh, while Stephen's men were tired from the siege. It would be wiser to retreat, gather reinforcements, and fight later when conditions were more favorable. But Stephen refused. Perhaps he remembered the shame of his father's flight from Antioch during the First Crusade. Perhaps he felt that a king could not run from battle without losing his followers' respect. Perhaps he simply had too much courage for his own good. Whatever his reasoning, Stephen decided to stay and fight. On the morning of February 2nd, 1141, Stephen attended Mass in Lincoln Cathedral. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, ominous signs appeared during the service. The candle Stephen was holding broke and went out. When it was relit, it went out again. Medieval people believed deeply in omens, and this must have shaken Stephen's men. But the king showed no sign of fear. After Mass, Stephen led his army out to meet Robert's forces. The two armies deployed on the flat ground outside Lincoln, near the river. Medieval battles were chaotic affairs, and our sources give different accounts of exactly what happened. But the general outline is clear. Stephen dismounted many of his knights, forming them into a dense infantry block. This was a defensive tactic, creating a solid formation that would be difficult for enemy cavalry to break. He placed himself in the center of this formation, fighting on foot like an ordinary soldier, rather than commanding from horseback. He was brave but foolhardy. A king was too valuable to risk in hand-to-hand combat. On Stephen's flanks were mounted knights, including several earls, the Earl of Ormale, the Earl of Surrey, and others. These mounted forces were supposed to protect Stephen's flanks and engage Robert's cavalry. Robert's army had 3 main divisions. Robert himself commanded the centre, with well-armed and experienced knights. Ranulph of Chester commanded another division, and on the flanks were the Welsh infantry, lightly armed but fierce in combat. When the battle began, the Welsh attacked Stephen's cavalry on the flanks. Despite being less heavily armed, the Welsh fought with desperate courage, and Stephen's mounted knights, outnumbered and facing determined opposition, began to give way. Then disaster struck. Several of the earls, seeing the battle going badly, fled the field. The chronicles don't make clear whether this was cowardice or calculated betrayal, but the result was the same. Stephen's flanks collapsed. With the flanks gone, Robert's cavalry could attack Stephen's infantry block from multiple directions. The king's men fought stubbornly, but they were surrounded and being cut down. Stephen himself fought with magnificent courage. According to chronicles, he wielded his sword until it broke, then grabbed a Danish battle axe and continued fighting. When that broke too, he fought on with whatever weapon came to hand, but courage alone could not save him. Overwhelmed by numbers, beaten down by exhaustion, Stephen was finally captured when a man named William de Canes struck him on the head with a rock and knocked him unconscious. It was an inglorious end to a heroic last stand. When Stephen came to, he was a prisoner. The King of England had been defeated and captured on the battlefield, something that had not happened in living memory. Robert of Gloucester had won a stunning victory. The Battle of Lincoln would change everything, or so it seemed. Matilda's brief ascendancy. The news of Stephen's capture spread across England like wildfire. The king, who had seemed secure on his throne despite the Civil War, was now a prisoner in chains. He was taken first to Gloucester, where Empress Matilda received him with cold formality, then moved to Bristol Castle, where he was held under close guard in conditions that grew increasingly harsh. For Matilda, this seemed like the moment she had been waiting for since her father's death. The usurper was defeated. The throne was within her grasp. Surely now the barons would recognize her as their rightful queen. Surely now the long struggle would end in her favor. But Matilda was about to discover that capturing a king and becoming queen were 2 very different things. Her first challenge was securing church support. Without the church's blessing, she could not be crowned. And without coronation, her claim remained incomplete. She needed to convince the church hierarchy, particularly the bishops, and most importantly, her cousin Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester and papal legate, to transfer their allegiance from Stephen to her. Bishop Henry was in a difficult position. He was Stephen's brother, bound by ties of blood and loyalty. But he was also a pragmatist who understood that Stephen's capture had fundamentally altered the political landscape. Moreover, Henry was ambitious. He had hoped that his brother's kingship would elevate the church's position and his own power. But if Matilda was going to be queen, Henry wanted to ensure his continued influence. In early March 1141, Henry of Blois met with Matilda at Winchester. They negotiated, and according to chronicles, Matilda made significant promises. She would grant the church control over ecclesiastical appointments, giving bishops and abbots greater autonomy. She would respect church property and privileges. She would govern in consultation with the church hierarchy. Henry of Blois satisfied with these assurances, agreed to support Matilda. On March 2nd, he formally recognized her as Lady of the English, the female equivalent of Lord of the English, a title that implied sovereignty, without technically claiming the crown before coronation. The next day, Matilda entered Winchester in triumph. Henry handed over the keys to the royal treasury and presented her with the royal crown that had been kept in Winchester Castle. It must have been an exhilarating moment for Matilda. After years of struggle, after watching Stephen rule what she considered her kingdom, she was finally being recognized. The treasury was hers. The crown, though not yet on her head, was in her possession. The papal legate himself had acknowledged her authority. On April 7th, a church council met at Winchester. The assembled clergy declared that Matilda should be queen in Stephen's place. They cited the oaths that had been sworn to her during her father's lifetime. They argued that Stephen's kingship had been illegitimate from the start. They released Stephen's supporters from their oaths to him, declaring that those oaths had been invalid because Stephen had obtained the throne through usurpation. With church support secured, Matilda turned her attention to London. The city's acceptance was crucial. London was England's wealthiest city, its commercial heart. More importantly, Westminster Abbey, where English kings were traditionally crowned, was just outside London's walls. Matilda needed London's support to complete her journey to the throne. But here, Matilda would encounter her first serious setback. The citizens of London were wary of her. Many of them had prospered under Stephen's rule. The king had granted the city valuable privileges and charters. He had been accessible and friendly, often walking among the citizens, attending their festivals, listening to their concerns. They had no such relationship with Matilda. Nevertheless, Matilda arrived at London in early June 1141, preparing to be crowned. She established herself in Westminster, close to the Abbey, where the coronation would take place. Arrangements were made for the ceremony. It seemed that within days, England would have its first queen regnant, but Matilda made a fatal error. When London's citizens came to her with petitions, requests for tax relief, confirmations of their traditional privileges, various other matters that required the new sovereign's attention, Matilda responded with arrogance and contempt. According to chronicles, which admittedly may be biased against her, Matilda treated the Londoners with haughty disdain. She demanded heavy taxes from the city to pay her soldiers. When the citizens protested, she reportedly told them harshly that they would pay what she demanded or face consequences. She showed none of the courtesy and accessibility that Stephen had displayed. She seemed to view the Londoners' requests as impertinent demands from social inferiors who should simply obey. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Medieval cities were proud of their privileges and fiercely protective of their autonomy. London in particular had a tradition of self-governance and expected to be consulted and respected. Matilda's treatment of the city's representatives angered not just the wealthy merchants, but ordinary citizens as well. The situation grew tense. Rumours spread through London that Matilda would impose harsh rule, that she would squeeze the city for money to fund her wars, that she cared nothing for English customs and traditions. Some whispered that she was more German than English, that her years as Holy Roman Empress had made her forget where she came from. Meanwhile, outside London, Stephen's supporters were not idle. Queen Matilda of Boulogne, that capable and determined woman who had supported her husband throughout his reign, was not about to accept defeat. She had escaped from Kent to Boulogne when Stephen was captured, but now she returned to England with fresh troops from her continental territories. She began gathering Stephen's remaining loyalists, building an army, and preparing to continue the fight even with her husband in prison. Queen Matilda's determination inspired Stephen's supporters. They had feared that with the king captured, their cause was lost. But seeing the queen refuse to surrender, they rallied. Barons who had been considering switching to Empress Matilda's side decided to wait and see what would happen. The situation was not as settled as it had appeared. Then, on June 24th, disaster struck for Empress Matilda. The citizens of London rose up against her, angry at her demands and fearful of her rule. They rang the city's bells, a signal for alarm, and formed armed mobs. They marched on Westminster, where Matilda was staying, shouting and threatening violence. Matilda, caught completely off guard, barely escaped. She fled Westminster in such haste that she left behind much of her baggage and treasure. She rode west, back toward her power base in Gloucester, humiliated and furious. Her coronation, which had seemed imminent, was cancelled. She had come tantalizingly close to the crown, only to be driven out by an angry populace. This rejection by London was a turning point. It showed that even with Stephen captured, even with church support, Matilda could not simply claim the throne. She lacked the popular support necessary to rule. Her personality, so stern, so uncompromising, so convinced of her own superiority, had alienated the very people whose acceptance she needed. But Matilda was not ready to give up. She still held Stephen prisoner. She still had powerful supporters, including Robert of Gloucester. She still controlled much of Western England. If she could not be crowned in London, she would continue the war until her enemies were completely defeated. Her next target was Winchester itself. Her cousin Bishop Henry, who had supported her in March, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He had expected Matilda to be grateful for his support and to govern in consultation with him. Instead, she had treated him with the same haughty manner she showed everyone else. She had made decisions without consulting him, had ignored his advice, and had made him feel that his support was taken for granted. Henry of Blois began to reconsider his allegiance. Perhaps he had been too hasty in abandoning his brother. Perhaps Stephen, despite his faults, was preferable to this arrogant woman who seemed incapable of working with others. Henry began secret negotiations with Queen Matilda of Boulogne and Stephen's other supporters. By late July, the situation had shifted dramatically. Henry of Blois openly broke with Empress Matilda and declared his support for Stephen once again. He barricaded himself in his episcopal palace at Winchester, Wolsey Castle, and prepared to defend it against Matilda's forces. Empress Matilda, outraged by what she saw as Henry's betrayal, marched to Winchester with an army. She arrived on July 31st and immediately laid siege to Wolsey Castle. Her forces established positions around the city, preparing for what they expected would be a relatively quick siege. Henry's garrison was not large, and surely he would have to surrender soon. But Matilda had walked into a trap. Even as she besieged Winchester, Queen Matilda of Boulogne was approaching from the east with a large army. The Queen had gathered Stephen's supporters, hired Flemish mercenaries under the command of William of Ypres, and brought the London militia. She also had the advantage of surprise. Empress Matilda had not expected this rapid response. Queen Matilda's army reached Winchester in early August and established positions around the city. Now Empress Matilda found herself in a terrible position. She had come to besiege Winchester, but now she herself was besieged. Her army was trapped inside the city, cut off from supplies, with no easy escape route. To make matters worse, on August 2nd, fire broke out in Winchester. Whether it was started deliberately by Henry of Blois' men or by accident, the result was catastrophic. The fire spread rapidly through the medieval city, where most buildings were made of wood with thatched roofs. Huge sections of Winchester were destroyed, including churches, houses, and markets. The cathedral survived, being built of stone, but much of the surrounding area was reduced to ash. The fire left Empress Matilda's army without adequate shelter. Food supplies that had been stored in the city were destroyed. The smoke and chaos disrupted military discipline, and all the while Queen Matilda's forces tightened their grip around the city. For several weeks, Empress Matilda's forces held out, hoping for relief that never came. But by early September, the situation had become desperate. Food was running low. The soldiers were demoralized. It was clear that they could not break out of the encirclement by force. On September 14th, Robert of Gloucester made the decision to attempt an escape. The plan was for Brian Fitzcount and Reginald of Cornwall to lead an advance guard, protecting Empress Matilda as she fled. The main body of the army would follow, with Robert himself commanding the rearguard to hold off pursuers. Early on September 14th, the attempt began. Matilda and her advance guard slipped out of Winchester's western gate and headed for the Salisbury Road. For a moment, it seemed they might escape cleanly, but Queen Matilda's forces had been watching for exactly this move. As soon as they saw the Angevin army leaving Winchester, they attacked. The advance guard, protecting Empress Matilda, managed to break through and escape. Matilda herself, exhausted and perhaps wounded, was carried away on a litter. She reached the safety of Devizes Castle, but the ordeal had been harrowing. Chronicles report that she arrived in a state of collapse, barely conscious. Behind her, the rest of her army was not so fortunate. Queen Matilda's forces crashed into the column of fleeing soldiers, cutting them down or scattering them. The main body of Matilda's army was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Robert of Gloucester, commanding the rearguard, fought with desperate courage to buy time for the others to escape. He held his position as long as possible, but eventually his men were overwhelmed. At a bridge over the River Test at Stockbridge, about 8 miles from Winchester, Robert found himself surrounded by William of Ypres' Flemish mercenaries. With no hope of escape, Robert of Gloucester surrendered. The Rout of Winchester, as this disaster came to be known, was a stunning reversal of fortune. In February, Stephen had been defeated and captured at Lincoln, and Matilda had seemed on the verge of victory. Now, barely 7 months later, Robert of Gloucester was a prisoner, and Matilda had fled in chaos. The war had come full circle. Now both sides held a valuable prisoner. Stephen was in Bristol Castle, held by Matilda's supporters. Robert was in the hands of Queen Matilda and Stephen's loyalists. Neither side could afford to lose their prisoner, but neither could they continue the war effectively without their captured leader. The solution was obvious: a prisoner exchange. But the negotiations would prove complex and would take weeks to arrange, during which the two Matildas, Empress and Queen, would engage in a battle of wills that neither could truly win. The negotiations for exchanging the prisoners began almost immediately after Robert of Gloucester's capture. Both sides understood that they needed their leaders back, but neither wanted to appear weak or desperate. The terms had to be carefully balanced to ensure that the exchange would actually happen, and that neither side would try to cheat. Queen Matilda of Boulogne took charge of the negotiations on Stephen's behalf. She had proven herself a capable political and military leader throughout the crisis, and she now displayed skill as a diplomat. She contacted Empress Matilda, proposing a straightforward exchange: Stephen for Robert, one leader for another. But Empress Matilda, even in defeat, tried to drive a hard bargain. She initially refused to exchange Stephen for Robert alone. She demanded additional concessions, perhaps other prisoners, perhaps gold, perhaps territorial guarantees. She seemed unable to accept that her position was not as strong as she imagined. Without Robert, her cause had no capable military commander. Her other supporters, while loyal, lacked Robert's experience and authority. The stalemate dragged on for weeks. Stephen remained imprisoned at Bristol, his conditions growing harsher as time passed. Chronicles report that he was eventually put in chains, bound like a common criminal. For a man who had been king, who had worn the crown and dispensed justice, this must have been a profound humiliation. Robert of Gloucester, meanwhile, was held by Queen Matilda. She treated him with more courtesy than Empress Matilda was showing Stephen, perhaps hoping that good treatment might incline Robert to abandon his half-sister and make peace. But Robert remained loyal to Matilda. Even imprisonment could not shake his commitment to what he saw as his duty. Finally, after weeks of negotiation, Empress Matilda accepted reality. She could not win additional concessions. She needed Robert back more than she needed to hold Stephen. An exchange was arranged, with elaborate precautions to ensure neither side would betray the agreement. The actual mechanics of the exchange were complex. Neither side trusted the other enough to simply hand over their prisoner and hope the other side would reciprocate. Instead, hostages were exchanged first, important nobles from each side who would guarantee good faith. Then the prisoners, themselves, would be released simultaneously at different locations. On All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1141, the exchange took place. Queen Matilda of Boulogne went to Bristol Castle with hostages, including one of her own sons, to secure Stephen's release. At the same time, at Winchester, Robert of Gloucester was released. Only when each side confirmed that their leader had been freed did they release the hostages. Stephen emerged from 9 months of captivity a changed man. The sources describe him as broken in spirit, suffering from what we would now recognize as depression. The ordeal of defeat, capture, and imprisonment had shattered something fundamental in him. He had been a king, confident and decisive. Now he seemed uncertain, prone to periods of inactivity and despair. But Queen Matilda was determined to restore her husband's position. She organized a ceremonial re-coronation at Canterbury Cathedral that Christmas. Stephen was crowned again, a symbolic assertion that his kingship had never truly ended, that the months of Empress Matilda's ascendancy had been an aberration. Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury performed the ceremony, and the assembled nobles renewed their oaths of loyalty to Stephen. Yet everyone knew that nothing had really been resolved. Empress Matilda was free and still claimed to be the rightful ruler. She still controlled much of Western England from her base at Bristol and Devizes. Robert of Gloucester was free and still commanded her armies. The civil war would continue. The winter of 1141-1142 was harsh, and the country suffered terribly. Armies had to be fed, and in winter, when crops were not growing and stored food was running low, soldiers took what they needed from peasants by force. Villages were plundered, livestock was slaughtered, grain stores were emptied. Ordinary people, who had no stake in the conflict between Stephen and Matilda, paid the price for their rulers' ambitions. Chronicles from this period paint a picture of widespread suffering. Monasteries, which usually maintained detailed records of local conditions, reported that some areas experienced near famine. Refugees fled devastated regions, seeking safety in areas less affected by the fighting. Some peasants abandoned their farms entirely, leaving land untilled and the villages deserted. The social order was breaking down in ways that terrified contemporaries. In a society that valued hierarchy and stability, where everyone was supposed to know their place, the chaos of the civil war seemed like a judgment from God. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints were asleep, meaning that God had withdrawn his protection from England, leaving the country to suffer for its sins. As winter turned to spring in 1142, Stephen began to stir himself to action. Slowly, with Queen Matilda's support and encouragement, he started to recover from his depression. He gathered his forces and began campaigning again, though he would never quite regain the energy and confidence of his early reign. One of his first targets was Wareham, a port town on the south coast that Robert of Gloucester had captured during Stephen's imprisonment. Stephen besieged the town and forced its surrender, a small victory that helped restore his confidence. He then moved on to other targets, slowly rebuilding his position. But Stephen's attention was soon drawn to Oxford, where Empress Matilda had established a base. Oxford was strategically important, controlling the upper Thames Valley and sitting astride important roads. Its castle was strong, and Matilda felt secure there. She held court, received petitions, and issued charters as if she were already queen. Stephen, perhaps remembering his own earlier mistake at Arundel when he had let Matilda escape, was determined not to repeat that error. If he could capture Matilda, the war might finally end. He gathered his forces and marched on Oxford in September 1142. Stephen's army approached Oxford quickly, giving Matilda little warning. According to chronicles, Stephen demonstrated impressive tactical skill in this campaign. Rather than following the roads, where his approach might be detected, he led his army cross-country, even swimming horses across rivers and streams to maintain surprise. It was a daring move that caught Matilda completely off guard. When Stephen's forces appeared before Oxford, Matilda's small garrison retreated into the castle. The city itself, unable to resist Stephen's large army, surrendered without a fight. Stephen's men occupied Oxford, surrounding the castle and cutting it off from any hope of relief. Now began what would become one of the most famous sieges of the entire Civil War. Stephen settled in for a long blockade, building siege works and maintaining a tight perimeter around the castle. He was not going to try to storm the fortress. That would be costly and might fail. Instead, he would starve Matilda into submission. It was simply a matter of time. Inside the castle, Matilda and her small garrison watched as their supplies dwindled. Autumn turned to winter. The weather grew cold. Food ran low, then ran out entirely. By December, the situation was desperate. The garrison was starving. Some of Matilda's knights wanted to negotiate a surrender, hoping that Stephen would show mercy to the Empress. But Matilda refused to surrender. She had not struggled this long, come this close to the throne, only to give up now. If she surrendered, she would be Stephen's prisoner, and she had no confidence he would treat her well. He might imprison her for life, or force her to publicly renounce her claim, or even worse. So Matilda and her closest supporters devised a desperate plan. They would attempt to escape from the besieged castle, slipping through Stephen's lines under cover of darkness. It was an enormous risk. If they were caught, they might be killed or captured, but staying meant certain capture eventually, so they had nothing to lose. The escape was planned for mid-December, when nights were longest. They would wait for a particularly cold night, when Stephen's sentries might be less alert, huddled around fires for warmth. And they had one advantage. It had been snowing heavily for several days, and the countryside was blanketed in white. On the chosen night, Matilda and 3 or 4 of her most trusted knights prepared to slip out of the castle. They dressed entirely in white cloaks, white robes, to camouflage themselves against the snow. According to some accounts, they left through a postern gate, a small door in the castle wall. Other accounts say they were lowered from the walls on ropes. The exact method is unclear, but what matters is that they got out of the castle without being detected. Then began one of the most dramatic journeys in medieval English history. Matilda, on foot because horses would make too much noise and leave obvious tracks, walked through 6 miles of heavy snow. She had to pass through Stephen's army, which was camped all around the castle. She had to cross the frozen Thames River, and she had to do all of this in the middle of a winter night, in temperatures cold enough to freeze the river solid. The chroniclers, writing years later, emphasized the miraculous nature of the escape. Some claimed that Matilda's white clothing made her invisible against the snow, that Stephen's sentries looked right past her. Others suggested that God himself intervened to protect her, striking the guards with confusion so they didn't see or hear her passing. More prosaically, it's likely that on a bitterly cold night, with snow falling and wind howling, the sentries were huddled around their fires and paying less attention than they should have been. Matilda and her companions walked 6 miles to Abingdon, where they had arranged for horses to be waiting. From Abingdon, they rode hard for Wallingford Castle, about 12 miles further west, where Brian Fitzcount, one of Matilda's most loyal supporters, held the fortress. They arrived at Wallingford exhausted, half frozen, and in a state of collapse. Matilda had frostbite, was suffering from exposure, and according to some accounts, her feet were so damaged from the journey that she could barely walk for weeks afterward. But she had escaped. Once again, Matilda had slipped through Stephen's fingers. The siege of Oxford ended the next day, when the garrison, learning that Matilda was safely away, surrendered to Stephen. But the prize Stephen had sought, Matilda herself, was gone. The escape from Oxford became legendary. It showed Matilda's courage and determination, her refusal to give up even in seemingly hopeless circumstances. But it also marked a turning point in the war. After Oxford, neither side would come close to achieving total victory. The conflict was settling into a grinding stalemate that would exhaust both sides and devastate the kingdom. The aftermath of Matilda's escape from Oxford left both sides reassessing their positions. Stephen had controlled the city and captured the castle, but his main prize had eluded him. Matilda had survived, but at tremendous cost. Her health was damaged, her resources depleted, and her position weaker than ever. From Wallingford, Matilda made her way to Devizes Castle, which became her primary residence for the next several years. Devizes was a powerful fortress in Wiltshire, strategically located and strongly defended. From there, she could coordinate with her supporters across Western England, though she would never again achieve the ascendancy she had briefly enjoyed in 1141. The years 1143 through 1147 saw the civil war settle into a frustrating pattern. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Stephen controlled London and the east. Matilda controlled much of the west. The Midlands and the north were contested, with local barons sometimes supporting one side, sometimes the other, and sometimes trying to remain neutral while they built their own power. Castle warfare dominated this period. Both sides built new fortifications and strengthened existing ones. Barons built unauthorized castles, the adulterine castles mentioned earlier, without seeking royal permission. Some chroniclers claim that over 1,000 castles were built during Stephen's reign, though modern historians believe this is an exaggeration. Still, the proliferation of fortifications was real and significant. It meant that the countryside was dotted with strongpoints from which local lords could control their territories, largely independent of royal authority. This fragmentation of power was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the anarchy. Even in areas nominally loyal to Stephen or Matilda, real power often lay with local barons who exploited the chaos to expand their own authority. They imposed illegal taxes, demanded forced labor from peasants, and acted like independent princes in their own territories. Robert of Gloucester continued to serve as Matilda's primary military commander, leading campaigns and sieges with skill and determination. But by 1147, Robert was aging and increasingly exhausted by the seemingly endless conflict. In October of that year, he fell ill with a fever at Bristol Castle. His condition worsened rapidly, and on October 31st, 1147, Robert died. His death was a catastrophic blow to Matilda's cause. Robert had been her most capable commander, her most loyal supporter, and effectively her second in command. Without him, Her military position became untenable. She had other supporters, Brian Fitzcount, Miles of Gloucester, and others, but none had Robert's combination of military skill, political acumen, and royal blood that had made him such an effective leader. Faced with Robert's death and the apparent impossibility of achieving victory, Matilda made a difficult decision. In 1148, she left England and returned to Normandy. She would never return to England. Her direct bid for the throne was over, but Matilda did not give up on her cause. Instead, she shifted her strategy. She would promote her son Henry as the rightful heir to the English throne. Henry was now 15 years old enough to begin taking an active role in the struggle. If Matilda could not be queen herself, perhaps her son could be king. This transition from Matilda's cause to Henry's cause marked a new phase in the conflict. The Civil War was no longer about whether England would accept a woman as ruler. It became about whether Stephen's line or Henry's line would continue the monarchy. And in this form, the conflict would finally find a resolution. The departure of Empress Matilda from England in 1148 did not end the Civil War, but it did change its character. Without Matilda personally present, the conflict lost some of its ideological intensity. It became less about rival claimants and more about practical power politics. Stephen, now in his 50s, worked to consolidate his control over England. He had survived the greatest crisis of his reign, his capture at Lincoln and the subsequent months of the imprisonment. He had weathered Matilda's challenge and driven her from the kingdom, but he had not achieved the stable, peaceful reign he had hoped for when he seized the throne 13 years earlier. The kingdom Stephen ruled was not the orderly realm his uncle Henry III had governed. Royal authority was weaker. Barons were more independent. Many of the administrative structures that Henry III had built, the exchequer, the system of royal justice, the network of sheriffs and officials, had broken down or functioned only sporadically. In many regions, local lords were effectively independent, acknowledging Stephen as king in name, but governing their territories as they saw fit. Stephen tried to address these problems, but he faced an impossible task. To restore royal authority, he needed to discipline rebellious barons, tear down unauthorized castles, and reassert control over the kingdom's administration. But doing so would require a level of ruthlessness and sustained effort that Stephen had never demonstrated. Moreover, he was constantly distracted by new crises. In 1149, young Henry Fitz-Empress, Empress Matilda's son, made his first attempt to claim the English throne. At 16 years old, Henry was tall, powerfully built, and full of energy. He had inherited his mother's intelligence and determination, but he also possessed qualities she had lacked: charm, political flexibility, and an ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. Henry landed in England with a small mercenary force, hoping to rally his mother's former supporters and launch a campaign against Stephen. But the venture was poorly planned and inadequately funded. Henry quickly ran out of money to pay his mercenaries. His military campaign achieved nothing. He found himself stranded in England, unable to pay his troops and unable to retreat to Normandy. In a curious episode that reveals something of Stephen's character, the king actually paid Henry's mercenaries himself and allowed the young prince to return safely to Normandy. Stephen's advisors must have been furious. Why pay your enemy's soldiers? Why let your rival escape? But Stephen apparently felt it would be dishonorable to take advantage of a youth who had gotten in over his head. It was a generous gesture, but it was also politically foolish. Henry would return, and next time, he would be far more dangerous. In Normandy, the situation had shifted decisively in Henry's favour. Geoffrey of Anjou had completed his conquest of the duchy by 1144. When Geoffrey died in 1151, Henry inherited Anjou and Normandy. giving him a solid power base in France. Then, in 1152, Henry made a marriage that would change European politics for generations. Eleanor of Aquitaine had been Queen of France, married to King Louis VII, but that marriage had been annulled in March 1152 after 15 years, officially because of consanguinity. They were too closely related, but really because Eleanor had failed to produce a male heir, and because the royal couple had grown to dislike each other. Eleanor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, ruler of Aquitaine in southwestern France, a territory larger and richer than many kingdoms. On May 18, 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis, Eleanor married Henry Fitz-Empress. She was 30 years old to Henry's 19, but the age difference didn't matter. What mattered was that Henry now controlled Normandy through inheritance, Anjou through inheritance, and Aquitaine through marriage. He ruled more of France than the French king himself. This vast accumulation of territories made Henry one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and he had not forgotten his claim to England. With Eleanor's resources added to his own, he could afford to mount a serious campaign against Stephen. Meanwhile, Stephen was dealing with his own succession problems. His wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, had died in May 1152. Her death deprived Stephen of his most capable advisor and supporter. She had been the strong partner in their marriage, the one who kept Stephen focused and resolute when his natural tendency toward leniency and indecision threatened his cause. Without her, Stephen seemed diminished. Stephen had 2 surviving sons. His eldest, Eustace, was now in his early 20s and expected to inherit the throne. Stephen desperately wanted to ensure Eustace's succession. To prevent the chaos that had followed Henry III's death, he attempted to have Eustace crowned during his own lifetime, a practice that would make the succession automatic and undisputed. But the Church refused. Pope Eugene III, influenced by various factors including pressure from supporters of Henry Fitz-Empress, forbade the Archbishop of Canterbury from crowning Eustace. This was a devastating blow to Stephen's hopes. Without church approval, Eustace could not be crowned, and without coronation, his succession would be questionable. Eustace, frustrated and angry, began acting more independently. He raised troops, seized territories, and conducted his own military campaigns, sometimes without coordinating with his father. Relations between Stephen and the barons became strained as Eustace's aggressive actions alienated potential supporters. Then, in August 1153, Eustace suddenly died. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Some sources say it was a fever. Others suggest food poisoning. A few whisper about possible assassination, though there's no real evidence for this. Whatever the cause, Eustace's death removed Stephen's heir and changed the entire political calculation. With Eustace dead, Stephen's only surviving son was William, a younger son who had not expected to inherit and who showed little interest in or aptitude for kingship. Stephen himself was now in his late 50s or early 60s, exhausted by years of war and facing a vigorous young rival in Henry Fitz-Empress. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine England's future. In January 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress landed in England with a well-equipped army. This was no half-hearted raid like his earlier attempt. Henry had learned from his mistakes. He had money to pay his troops, supplies to sustain a campaign, and clear strategic objectives. He was 20 years old, energetic, and determined to claim what he considered his birthright. Henry's campaign in 1153 showed impressive military and political skill. Rather than seeking immediate confrontation with Stephen, he focused on consolidating his position. He landed in the southwest, linking up with his mother's former supporters. He captured several castles, demonstrating his military capability, but he also negotiated with barons, offering them peace and security if they would support his cause. Many barons, exhausted after 15 years of civil war, were receptive to Henry's overtures. They saw in him something they hadn't seen in either Stephen or Matilda, a ruler who might actually be able to end the conflict and restore peace. Henry was young and vigorous. He controlled vast territories in France, giving him resources that Stephen could not match. And perhaps most importantly, he was willing to be flexible and pragmatic in ways that his mother had never been. Stephen responded to Henry's invasion by gathering his forces and marching to confront him. The two armies met at Wallingford in July 1153, preparing for what might be the decisive battle of the entire civil war. If Stephen could defeat Henry, the young prince might retreat to France and not return. If Henry defeated Stephen, the war would effectively be over. But the battle never happened. As the two armies faced each other across the Thames, both sides' barons began negotiating. They had fought each other for 15 years. They had seen friends and family members killed. They had watched England devastate itself, and they were tired. The barons essentially told their leaders that they would not fight this battle. Too much blood had been shed already. Too much treasure had been wasted. The kingdom needed peace, not another battle that might resolve nothing. If Stephen and Henry wanted to continue fighting, they would have to do so without baronial support. Faced with this rebellion of exhaustion, Stephen and Henry had to negotiate. Neither could achieve victory by force if their own supporters refused to fight. They had to find a political solution. The negotiations were complex and took months to complete, but they were helped by two crucial factors. First, Eustace's death in August meant that Stephen had no obvious heir who might object to an agreement that bypassed his succession. Second, both Stephen and Henry were pragmatists willing to compromise to achieve their objectives. The solution they eventually reached was elegant in its simplicity. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life. He would retain all the dignity, authority, and power of the monarchy, but he would adopt Henry as his son and heir, naming him the next king of England. When Stephen died, Henry would peacefully succeed to the throne without conflict. This agreement, known as the Treaty of Wallingford or the Treaty of Winchester, it was negotiated at both places, was formally announced in November 1153 at Winchester Cathedral. The ceremony was designed to emphasize reconciliation and peace. Stephen and Henry met publicly, embraced, and exchanged the kiss of peace. Henry did homage to Stephen, acknowledging him as king. Stephen adopted Henry as his son, making the succession legal and binding. The treaty included several other important provisions. Stephen's surviving son William would renounce any claim to the throne, but in exchange, he would keep his father's hereditary lands and titles, ensuring that Stephen's family would not be left destitute. Foreign mercenaries, who had prolonged the conflict and terrorized the countryside, would be sent home. Unauthorized castles built during the Civil War would be destroyed. Lands seized during the conflict would be returned to their rightful owners where possible. Most importantly, both sides agreed to a general peace. Fighting would stop. The Civil War was over. The reaction to the treaty was overwhelmingly positive. Barons on both sides welcomed the agreement. The Church praised it as a just and Christian solution. Common people, who had suffered most during the war, thanked God that the fighting was finally ending. But the peace was fragile. Many historians have noted that the Treaty of Winchester was described by contemporaries as a precarious peace. Stephen might have lived for many more years. He was in his late 50s, not ancient by any means. Henry's position in France was not entirely secure. There were rumors that William, Stephen's son, despite his public renunciation, might attempt to seize power when Stephen died. Some of Stephen's most loyal supporters were unhappy with the treaty and might cause trouble. Moreover, The practical implementation of the treaty's provisions would be difficult. How would they determine which lands should be returned to whom? How would they decide which castles should be destroyed? Who would enforce these decisions? These were questions that could have reignited conflict if not handled carefully. But despite these concerns, the treaty held. Stephen and Henry both worked to implement its terms. Mercenaries were paid off and sent home. Some unauthorized castles were destroyed, though not as many as the treaty specified. The work of dismantling hundreds of fortifications would take years. Disputes over land were addressed through negotiations and, where necessary, royal judgments. Stephen, perhaps sensing that his time was short, threw himself into governance with renewed energy in the months after the treaty. He travelled extensively throughout the kingdom, holding court, hearing cases, issuing charters. He seemed determined to restore royal authority and demonstrate that he was still capable of ruling effectively. Perhaps he wanted to prove to himself and others that his reign had not been the complete failure that critics claimed. Henry, for his part, returned to Normandy to address issues there, but he stayed in contact with Stephen and maintained a presence in England through his supporters. The two men, who might have been bitter enemies, developed something like mutual respect. Stephen recognized that Henry was genuinely capable and would make a good king. Henry came to appreciate that Stephen, despite his flaws, was not a bad man, just a man who had been in over his head. As 1154 progressed, Stephen's health began to decline. He had never fully recovered from the trauma of his imprisonment at Bristol. He suffered from stomach problems, perhaps an ulcer, or perhaps appendicitis, or perhaps simply the accumulated stress of 20 years of conflict. He consulted physicians, but medieval medicine could do little for him. By autumn, it was clear that Stephen was dying. He made his peace with the church, confessed his sins, received the sacraments. He made provisions for his wife's tomb. Queen Matilda had been buried at Faversham Abbey, which the royal couple had founded, and Stephen wanted to be buried beside her. In October 1154, Stephen travelled to Dover, perhaps to meet with continental visitors, or simply to attend to business at that important port. While there, his condition worsened dramatically. He developed severe abdominal pain, began vomiting blood, and grew weaker by the hour. On October 25, 1154, King Stephen died at Dover, attended by Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury and a few close retainers. He was about 58 or 62 years old, depending on which birth year is correct. He had been king for 19 years, longer than many medieval monarchs, but those had been 19 troubled years that had aged him prematurely. News of Stephen's death was sent to Henry, who was in France. The treaty had held. There was no succession crisis, no scramble for the throne, no renewed civil war. Everything proceeded according to the agreement. On December 19, 1154, Henry Fitz-Empress was crowned King Henry II of England at Westminster Abbey. He was 21 years old. The first Plantagenet king had ascended the throne. A new era in English history was beginning. Stephen's death and Henry II's smooth succession marked the end of the anarchy, but it did not immediately restore peace and prosperity to England. The damage of 19 years of civil war could not be undone overnight. Henry II would spend the early years of his reign addressing the problems Stephen's reign had created, destroying unauthorized castles, disciplining rebellious barons, restoring royal justice and administration, rebuilding the kingdom's finances. But what of Stephen himself? How should we judge this man who seized the throne, held it for nearly 2 decades despite constant challenges, but never achieved the stable, prosperous reign he had hoped for? Medieval chroniclers were divided in their assessments. Those writing during or shortly after Stephen's reign tended to be harsh. They blamed him for the anarchy, for the suffering of the common people. for the breakdown of law and order. They portrayed him as weak, indecisive, too kind to his enemies and too harsh to the church. Some suggested that his usurpation of the throne had been a sin for which God punished England itself, but others offered more nuanced views. They acknowledged Stephen's personal courage, his generosity, his courtesy. They noted that he had seized the throne quickly and decisively, showing that he was capable of bold action when necessary. They pointed out that he had faced extraordinary challenges, a rival claimant with a strong case, powerful enemies, limited resources. Perhaps no king could have succeeded under those circumstances. Modern historians have generally been more sympathetic to Stephen than his contemporaries were. They recognize that he was placed in an impossible position. His uncle Henry III had tried to impose an unprecedented female succession on a society unprepared for it. When Stephen seized the throne, he had substantial support from nobles who genuinely believed that a male ruler would be better for the kingdom. He was not simply a usurper motivated by personal ambition. He was responding to real concerns about the succession. Moreover, historians now recognize that the chaos of Stephen's reign was not entirely his fault. Much of the violence and disorder resulted from structural problems in Anglo-Norman society. The dual nature of the Anglo-Norman realm, split between England and France, the power of barons who could operate semi-independently from royal authority, the weakness of legal and administrative institutions that depended heavily on a strong king's personal oversight. Stephen's fundamental problem was that he lacked the ruthlessness necessary for successful medieval kingship. He was, by all accounts, a decent man, generous, brave, personally likable. These were admirable qualities in an individual, but weaknesses in a king. Medieval kingship required the ability to intimidate and, when necessary, destroy one's enemies. It required the willingness to seize property, execute traitors, and rule through a combination of fear and respect. Stephen tried to rule through kindness and compromise. When barons rebelled, he forgave them. When he captured enemies, he let them go. When difficult decisions had to be made, he hesitated. He wanted everyone to like him. And in medieval politics, this desire was fatal. Henry I, Stephen's uncle, had understood this. He had ruled with an iron fist, crushing rebellion ruthlessly, imposing harsh punishments on those who defied him. He had kept detailed records, maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy, and left nothing to chance. England under Henry III had been orderly, prosperous, and terrified of the king, which was exactly how Henry wanted it. Stephen could never be that kind of king. His nature was too gentle, his personality too accommodating. And so his reign descended into chaos, not because he was evil or incompetent, but because he was too kind for the position he held. There is something tragic about Stephen. He was a man of genuine good qualities, placed in a position that required qualities he didn't possess. He won the throne through decisive action, but couldn't hold it through decisive governance. He was brave in battle but weak in counsel. He could win individual conflicts but couldn't win the larger war. He could seize opportunities but couldn't build on his successes. His greatest failure was perhaps his treatment of Empress Matilda at Arundel in 1139, when he had the chance to capture his rival and end the civil war before it truly began. He instead allowed chivalry and courtesy to override strategic necessity. He let Matilda go, and England paid the price in 19 years of warfare. Yet we might also ask, what would have happened if Stephen had captured Matilda at Arundel? Would her supporters have surrendered, or would they have fought on in her name? Would Geoffrey of Anjou have invaded England to free his wife? Would the church have accepted Matilda's imprisonment? We cannot know. Perhaps Stephen's decision, while ultimately unsuccessful, avoided an even worse outcome. Stephen's burial took place at Faversham Abbey in Kent, the monastery he and Queen Matilda had founded. He was laid to rest beside his wife and his son, Eustace. It must have been a bittersweet moment for those who attended the funeral. Stephen had held the throne against all challenges and was being buried as a king, but the throne was passing to his rival's son, not his own bloodline. Later, during King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, Faversham Abbey was destroyed. The royal tombs were lost, and according to some accounts, the bones of Stephen, Matilda, and Eustace were thrown into a nearby creek. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened or whether the remains were preserved somehow, but regardless, Stephen's final resting place is lost to history, a fitting end perhaps for a king whose reign has been remembered more for its failures than its successes. Yet Stephen's legacy was not entirely negative. His reign, chaotic as it was, actually demonstrated the importance of certain political principles. It showed that England needed clear succession laws rather than relying on royal designation and baronial oaths. It showed that the Anglo-Norman dual monarchy was unstable and needed reform. It showed that royal authority required institutional support, not just personal loyalty to an individual king. Henry II learned from Stephen's mistakes. He rebuilt royal government, strengthened legal institutions, reformed the judiciary, and created administrative structures that would outlast any individual king. The Plantagenet monarchy that emerged from the Anarchy was stronger than the Norman monarchy that preceded it, precisely because the chaos of Stephen's reign had revealed weaknesses that needed to be addressed. In this sense, Stephen's troubled reign was not entirely wasted. It was a harsh lesson in how not to govern, but it was a lesson that England learned well. The royal government that Henry II built, drawing on both his grandfather Henry III's innovations and the painful lessons of Stephen's failures, would serve England for generations. Stephen's personal story ended in 1154, but Empress Matilda would live another 13 years. She never remarried after Geoffrey of Anjou's death in 1151. Instead, she lived quietly in Normandy, advising her son Henry II, and watching with satisfaction as he succeeded where she had failed. She saw Henry consolidate his power, reform England's government, and establish the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule for more than 3 centuries. Matilda died on September 10, 1167, at the age of 65. She was buried at the Abbey of Notre-Dame-du-Pré, near Rouen, in Normandy. Her tomb bore an inscription that captured how she saw herself. Here lies the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry III, Henry V, and Henry II. She had been a king's daughter, an emperor's wife, and a king's mother. That she had not herself worn a crown must have been a lifelong source of frustration and regret. The civil war between Stephen and Matilda had lasted 19 years, from Stephen's seizure of the throne in 1135 to the Treaty of Winchester in 1153, or arguably until Stephen's death in 1154. It had devastated England, killed thousands, displaced countless others, and set back the kingdom's development by at least a generation. But it had also been a crucible that forged something new. The Anarchy destroyed the old Norman way of governing and forced the creation of new institutions. It demonstrated that personal loyalty was insufficient to hold a kingdom together. Formal laws and procedures were necessary. It showed that succession needed to be absolutely clear and unambiguous. Most importantly, perhaps, it showed that England needed a strong monarchy supported by effective institutions, but also that the monarchy needed limits. The barons who forced Stephen and Henry to negotiate peace in 1153 were asserting that the nobility had a voice in governance, that kings could not simply do as they pleased. This principle, though it would take centuries to fully develop, eventually led to constitutional monarchy and the rule of law. So as we close the story of King Stephen and the Anarchy, we might reflect on what this turbulent period teaches us about power, ambition, and governance. Stephen was not a bad man, but he was perhaps the wrong man at the wrong time. His kindness, which would have been admirable in a baron or a bishop, was a fatal weakness in a king. His desire to please everyone left him trusted by no one. Matilda, conversely, had many of the qualities needed in a ruler: intelligence, determination, strength of will. But her inability to compromise, her haughty manner, and most of all, her gender in a society unprepared for female rule, prevented her from achieving her goal. And so England muddled through 19 years of chaos until exhaustion and pragmatism forced a settlement that neither side would have accepted earlier. Henry II inherited a kingdom that had been torn apart, but he also inherited a kingdom that had learned hard lessons about what worked and what didn't in governance. The Anarchy was England's civil war, a period when the realm nearly tore itself apart over questions of legitimacy, succession, and power. But England survived, emerged stronger, and began building the institutions that would eventually make it one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in Europe. King Stephen's reign ended in failure, but that failure was not meaningless. Sometimes, history's lessons are taught through negative examples. Stephen showed what happened when a king was too kind, too indecisive, too eager to please. His successors learned from his mistakes and governed accordingly. And so, as you drift into sleep tonight, dear listener, remember this tale of a king who meant well but couldn't quite succeed, of a woman who deserved better but couldn't quite win, of a civil war that accomplished nothing but taught everything. Remember that history is made not just by heroes and villains, but by flawed human beings trying to navigate impossible situations with imperfect wisdom. Sleep well, knowing that even the darkest periods eventually end, that even the worst conflicts eventually resolve, and that from chaos and suffering, new orders and new hopes can emerge. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful, free from the clash of swords and the cries of war. Rest now in the comfort of your bed, far from the frozen rivers and besieged castles of medieval England. The story is ended. The players long since turned to dust, but their tale remains to teach and to soothe you into gentle slumber. Until next time, from all of us at Sleepy Crown, good night and sweet dreams.